Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 347. It is the end of April, so therefore it is the Patreon Drydock once more. Well, people asked an awful lot of questions, so let's just get on with them. Patrick Donnelly asks, for an April Fool's question, which navy that the channel covers would have the best chance of fighting dragons or incorporating them into their doctrine? Both the swimming and flying kind, so anything from Toothless Size to Balerion, the Black Dread. And here poor old HMS Dragon feels left out. Nonetheless, well, there's quite a wide range of questions there. I mean, obviously for the time period the channel covers, the navy that would have the best chance of fighting dragons would be the one with the most anti-aircraft guns and, well, the best anti-aircraft fire direction and control systems, so that essentially means the US Navy in World War II. Now, the weird thing is, when it comes to incorporating them into their doctrine, you kind of have a catch-22 situation, because in the time period where historically you get things like aircraft carriers or aircraft operating vessels, so instead of having a catapult-launched biplane, you might have a toothless-sized dragon, or for a carrier, you might have 2 or 3 really big dragons, or something like that. Well, that's also the era of steam and steel, and whilst steam and steel era warships are still somewhat flammable, they're not quite as flammable as Age of Sail era warships, although how much benefit a steel superstructure is going to do you against something like Toothless, who seems to have some kind of plasma blast, is another question entirely. And of course, that's also the era where there's anti-aircraft guns, which would mean dragons are very much at risk. So in the steam and steel era, I think you could potentially look at a compromise situation of late World War I. There are anti-aircraft guns, yes. There aren't that many of them, and they aren't very good. But you do already have the principle of some of the early aircraft carriers being developed. And you also have things like the Grand Fleet mounting well over 100 aircraft on little launch platforms on their turrets. So again, those launch platforms would make really good points to station smaller, quick dragons, and the early aircraft carriers would actually make superb places to put large dragons, because large dragons, at least if we go by most dragon lore, don't need full-length flight decks, extended runways and so forth. So something like HMS Furious with separate landing decks fore and aft might actually work really well, because then you also have the smokestack in the middle, and the dragons might like clustering around it for warmth. Of course, Age of Sail, as I said, ships are far more vulnerable to dragons and have almost no capability to fight back against them. They're much slower as well, so a dragon that's flying at perhaps more realistic speeds, at least in as far as a dragon is concerned, will have an easier time overhauling and outmaneuvering an Age of Sail vessel. The flip side of that is, of course, that Age of Sail vessels need masts and sails to move, which is going to make them very difficult to mount dragons on, unless you're talking again about toothless-sized small dragons, i.e. dragons the size of large livestock, maybe a little bit bigger, but something the size of Game of Thrones dragons isn't really going to fit on a sailing ship, because all the masts and the rigging is going to get in the way. Now, I'm aware, of course, there is the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, which is set in the Napoleonic War era, and they do have dragon carriers there, although from the written descriptions they seem to just have, essentially like some of the modern survey ships have a big helipad right up on the bow, they have a dragon pad forward of the foremast. So smaller dragons, yeah, they could operate off of a ship of land. There's probably enough space on the poop deck, for example. But I suspect what you'd probably see might be an outgrowth of the medieval cog or the slightly later medieval galleon, high forecastle and aft castle. And perhaps instead of going high, it would maybe only go up one level, but spread out further with major support beams. And given the overall distribution of weight and underwater volume on a ship, perhaps actually aft would be better, because then a dragon can fly in and land with the flow of the ship, and ultimately it's a dragon, it can take off in any direction it really wants. Brian Smith asks, Why are some Royal Navy ship classes named for the lead ship, like the King George V or Queen Elizabeth class, and some classes named for the general name type, flower class, town class, battle class, county class, etc.? Very broadly speaking, there's essentially 4 paths to this. So the 2 most obvious ones tend to be at the higher end of things, so battleships and carriers, and at the very low end of things with destroyers and so forth. And that is there a commonality within the names? So, for example, the Queen Elizabeth class, there is no particular connection between Queen Elizabeth of Warspite, Valiant, Barham, and Malaya. Therefore, naming them some kind of abstract doesn't really work because there is no abstract to connect the ships. Therefore, Queen Elizabeth class. And this works with most of the battleships. A notable exception, of course, being the Revenge class, which are notionally the Revenge class, but are sometimes foreshortened to R class, both in unofficial and official correspondence, and occasionally people use Royal Sovereign class as well, but of course there you have the connective of all the names beginning with R. Then flipping all the way down to the lowest end of things, there, rather than people going, okay, we need to choose names for individual ships, when it comes to things like destroyers and sloops and corvettes, very often a theme of a name will be agreed. So flower class, river class, battle class, tribal class, etc. And that would be agreed before any names are actually selected, and that's usually how you then get a insert quality or descriptive here class. There's also the fact that with these really small ships, traditionally, when it comes to ships, you would try and name the class after the first of the class to be launched into service. And normally that's the first ship to be laid down, will also be the first to be launched, will be the first to enter service, so it all works out fine. But when you get to small ships, you can't necessarily guarantee that the first one you order will be the first one launched or in service. That, first laid down, first launched, and first to commission might actually be 3 separate ships, which, for example, is actually one of the reasons why the R-class battleships sometimes go by Revenge, sometimes go by Royal Sovereign, and sometimes even by Resolution class, because it's a complete mess. Because if you wanted to name the Revenge class, which is what I tend to use, by the first ship ordered, it would be Revenge class. If you wanted to name it by the first ship laid down, that would actually be the Ramillies class. If you wanted to name it by the first ship launched, that would be the Royal Oak class. And if you wanted to name it by the first ship commissioned, then it would be the Revenge class. And to get even more fun, if you want to name it by earliest pennant number, then it's the Royal Sovereigns. And then you get kind of intermediate levels. So this is usually cruisers. And at that point, it can be a real mix of things, because sometimes it will be decided before the ships are built that, yes, this will be the overarching nomenclature class, but it can go through several revisions. And once the ships are in service, at the time they're in service, you will get a variety of ways to reference them. So, for example, with the counties, initially you'll see a lot of correspondence in the 20s and early 30s to the Kent class rather than the county class. But as additional, what we would now call subclasses, are brought in, you start to see more mentions of county class as opposed to Kent class. The towns originally weren't supposed to be the towns. They were supposed to continue a alphabetical designation system, but not only was the lead ship changed, but then it was also decided, well, we're actually going to name them after towns rather than some of the original designated names, and so it became town class. But even then, you'll still see references quite a lot in World War II documents to Southampton class as opposed to town class, because Southampton was the lead ship. And the same thing with Crown Colony-Fiji class. Officially, people will say it's the Fiji class, but there's plenty of documentation from the period that calls them Crown Colonies as well. So what tends to happen is if a class gets a whole bunch of derivatives or very close derivatives, i.e. subclasses, like the towns and the counties did, then people tend to group them together as time goes on as towns and counties rather than three separate classes with extremely similar characteristics and which to the untrained eye might be very difficult to distinguish. And so that's kind of your third case where things develop a little bit. And then you have what I would term the hybrids, where people can refer to either one and everyone is kind of, well, yeah, it's generally accurate and there isn't really a settled scheme. Because as I said, although with the towns and the counties you'll have Kents and Southamptons being bandied about post-war, and nowadays it's mostly town and county, whereas if you were to say, is this a D-class cruiser or an E-class cruiser for the late World War I, immediate post-World War I Royal Navy cruisers, for example, or is it a Danae or an Emerald class cruiser? It's not really settled one way or another on those, because you do have the common nomenclature of all the D or Danaes, all their names begin with D, the same with the E-class or Emeralds, albeit there aren't that many of them, but it's also equally valid to use the lead ship class name. Michael Moynihan asks, when your nation is building warships for another navy, has anyone changed the lines on the design, so to speak, to make it slightly less capable than it should in theory be capable of, in order to give the home nation a future advantage? Or perhaps they took specific design knowledge and then used it to help defeat that enemy later on? So I think there's two separate issues in play. Yes, if a foreign warship was being built in a national yard, if you were ever at war with that nation later on, absolutely the yard it was built in would be turning over all the plans and drawings to the government to work out if there was any weakness that you could use to exploit in battle. And we know on the few occasions that this did occur that this absolutely was done. I mean, when tensions were beginning to escalate with Japan in the interwar period, for example, the lines and plans for the Congos and the Fusos were being pored over by the Royal Navy to work out what they could do about them. You know, are there any particular weaknesses they could exploit? Are there any particular strengths that they should note, and so forth? Of course, that information from the World War I era period became less and less useful the more and more those ships were refitted and departed from their original designs, but it was still a useful baseline of knowledge to work from. But in terms of deliberately sabotaging the ship to make it less capable, no, as far as I can tell, that was practically never done. Occasionally you would get that kind of effect anyway if the build didn't really go to plan, but deliberately, no, for multiple reasons. Firstly, that's a very good way to lose business, you know, if it becomes known, and it would become known because, of course, ships undergo acceptance trials. So if you mess around with the ship and so perhaps make it a knot slower than it should be, then at best you're going to get a reputation as a shipyard that can't live up to its promises and people won't buy from you anymore. And at worst, you know, you might get stung with a penalty and told either we're not going to pay you a bunch of money, i.e. we're taking a bunch of money back, or, and that'll probably be a clause in your contract, or you'll be told, no, this isn't good enough, take it back, fix it, and make it do what we paid you to make it do in the first place, either one of which is going to cost you a huge amount of money. And usually when you're building a warship for export, it's because you have the bigger shipbuilding industry than the person who's buying it from you, at which point the ship's going to fall into one of a few categories. Either it's a budget version, so it's less capable than the ones you're building for yourself anyway, so it doesn't really matter what its capabilities are, or it's about as good as the ones that you're building for yourself at the moment, in which case you're building more of them because you're the bigger navy, so again, it probably doesn't matter all that much anyway, or potentially it might be a little bit better than anything you're building for yourself at the time. So look at all the Führer and the Miniscarais class, for example, when they're being constructed. But if your own shipyards are capable of building that thing, then, well, in theory, once it's completed, you should be able to then order one of your own, perhaps with additional improvements. And again, it isn't too much of a worry. assuming that you are the larger navy building for a smaller one. Of course, if you are a small or medium-sized navy building for a peer navy, what exactly are you doing? That doesn't really happen very often. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, secondary batteries on post-World War I battleships. It seems that after the major fleet actions of World War II, the idea that battleships would be fighting off cruisers and destroyers with their secondary batteries would be a very minor use compared to the rise of aircraft. Why was so much emphasis still put on heavy anti-shipping firepower in post-World War I designs for battleships? Split batteries were still heavily used by a number of navies, and even the American all 5-inch battery was a compromise in that the 5-inch 38 compromised between anti-surface and anti-air action with the best length of its barrel. Strange as it may seem in retrospect, the argument for a heavy secondary battery for anti-shipping purposes in the interwar World War II environment, at least until the war was well underway, had actually increased during the interwar period. Because back when you could build pretty much to whatever your budget or industry allowed you to, yes, you would have a secondary battery on a battleship primarily for dealing with destroyers who might torpedo you, but both sides would have fairly large screens of cruisers, potentially you'd also have your own large screen of destroyers, and so you only really needed the secondaries to take on the few small ships that might leak through. However, when you're going into the interwar period and the early World War II period, suddenly you have considerably fewer capital ships, so each one is proportionally more valuable, and relatively speaking, and depending on the treaty, how much, whether you're allocated a specific tonnage or whether you're allocated unlimited tonnage but with tonnage limits per ship, you actually potentially have proportionally far more destroyers and cruisers in both your fleet and your potential opponent's fleet than you do capital ships. So, for example, if you look at the Battle of Jutland, the Royal Navy brings 26 light cruisers and 8 armoured cruisers for a total of 34 cruisers of all types, and the Germans bring just 11 light cruisers, as compared to 37 capital ships for the Royal Navy, if you include battleships and battle cruisers, and for the Germans, if you include the pre-dreadnaughts as well, they're bringing a total of 29. So on both sides, there are actually more capital ships at the Battle of Jutland than there are cruisers. And in both cases, roughly speaking, there's a roughly 2-to-1 ratio of destroyers that they're bringing versus number of capital ships. Now you think even about the navies with the most capital ships in the Second World War, the US and British navies, they've got a huge number more light and heavy cruisers than they have capital ships, and they have, almost an order of magnitude, if not more destroyers than they have capital ships. And that's even if you include carriers in that, to be perfectly honest. So statistically, the chances of a capital ship being attacked by a cruiser or a destroyer have actually gone up, and that means you actually need more heavy-hitting, fast-firing secondaries than perhaps you necessarily needed in the First World War. The sheer number of First World War secondaries was more to do with the fact you couldn't really guarantee to hit at anything much with 4, 5, 6, 8 guns, so it's better to have 12, 14, 16 guns just to make sure you threw enough shells out there to hit something in time. Ed asks, I'm curious about how combatant ship classes were defined in any era. How did they draw a line between heavy cruiser and light cruiser, destroyer and destroyer escort? Were there distinctly different designs all lumped together as corvettes? Well, I do have 2 entire videos actually on ship classes in both the Age of Sail and the Age of Steam, but very, very briefly, in the Age of Sail, so starting with the late 15th going into the 16th century and then onwards, initially ships, when they're divided at all, are divided by crew number and purpose. So essentially, are you supposed to be sitting around looking pretty and fighting in a big fight, or are you a scout ship? And beyond that, it's, well, this is a great ship, but it has, let's say, 1,000 crew, and this is another great ship, but it only has 500 crew, therefore it is slightly less. Then you move into the system of rates, which admittedly is a British invention, but tends to get applied across the board because it's actually relatively navy agnostic. And you do get similar systems in other navies. The French will use first rank instead of rate, for example. And that is largely on the basis of number of anti-ship guns present, usually as dictated by the number of gun ports the ship is pierced for, at which point first, second and third rates are ships of the line, all based, as I said, on number of guns. And then fifth rates and sixth rates are always frigates. Fourth rates early on are the smaller ships of the line, and then later on become the largest of frigates. Then you get into the ironclad period, and essentially at that point you have capital ships, battleships, whatever you want to call them, and everything else. And there'll be a whole slew of terms: frigate, corvette, sloop, etc. Most of them have nothing to do with how they originated. They're just various flavors of term for not a line of battle vessel. And eventually, at least in the Royal Navy, they all get grouped together into cruiser, and initially first class, second class, third class cruiser, which is just another fancy way of saying not a line of battleship. It's only really with the advent of the torpedo boat that you start to see a very layered structure developing, because suddenly you have torpedo boats which will become destroyers, which can threaten large ships, so you need some of your own, plus you need cruisers in a distinct role and capacity, both for overseas trade, protection and fleet scouting, but also to guard against the smaller fast attack craft. And it all becomes a little bit mutually supporting, because a cruiser can defend a capital ship from a destroyer, but in turn needs protection itself from enemy capital ships, who in turn can be threatened with your own fast attack craft, and so on and so forth. Heavy cruiser and light cruiser are just pretty much artificial distinctions created by the London Naval Treaty that said you can only have so many cruisers with 8-inch guns and so many cruisers with 6.1-inch or below. And the main difference between a destroyer and a destroyer escort, or escort destroyer, is essentially that a destroyer has to be a fully rounded fleet vessel, so it has to be very fast, carry a heavy torpedo armament, plus guns, plus potentially anti-submarine equipment, whereas a destroyer escort or escort destroyer is generally somewhat lighter on the main gun and torpedo department, although they will have some, and much heavier on the anti-submarine warfare department, and generally will sacrifice some speed, but not as much as a corvette or a frigate. Daniel Silverthorne asks, in the movie Here Comes the Navy, a romantic comedy from 1934 starring James Cagney and other notables of the day, a recently modernised USS Arizona features as the primary setting. In the film, there's a scene of averting a mishap in one of her primary turrets, or possibly in a magazine. How accurately is the scene portrayed, and how accurate is the set, since it's unlikely this was filmed on an actual ship? Well, if it's the section where there's a fire in the turret, then as far as I can tell, the accuracy of the set is 100% spot on, because I think that is pretty much Arizona's turret. Having been inside the turret of USS Texas, as well as the turret of some of the more modern preserved museum battleships, I'm 99.9% sure that is actually the Texas's turret, and that's probably US Navy sailors doing their reload drill, which would be why the camera doesn't move around all that much. It's in fixed positions because there are relatively few places you could put a camera while everybody is actively trying to shift everything around. And that in turn would make the general accuracy of this scene pretty much spot on. Even the way that the fire starts with a small bit of burning material coming out of the gun barrel out of the open breach is in theory realistic. It was one of the worst nightmares of a ship, but of course that's why you use silk bags, because it's supposed to completely consume itself, and there's all sorts of other systems to evacuate the bore as well. So it shouldn't happen, but there is an outside potential that it could happen, and that is obviously therefore theoretically, albeit unlikely, a still realistic scenario. The one problem, I would say, with the whole thing, because you can see from the screen cap, is that they're engineering a fire, but they're trying to engineer a fire in such a way that only a few people get burnt. And you can kind of see off to the right there what's happened is that one of the charge bags has split and is now dumping black powder everywhere. It's dumping it into the loading tray, it's dumping it on the floor, and eventually that will reach the burning bit of silk and up it'll all go. Now, the reason the particular way this happens is a little bit unrealistic is that, well, for one thing, when you look at the total amount of black powder that's actually spilled, that's far, far too much for the ignition pad at the base of the bag. Now, then, luckily, they're not saying the whole bag is full of black powder. You do actually see the main propellant SPD pellets falling out during the sequence, but the sheer amount of powder that ends up being scattered around is a little bit unrealistic. Plus, you can see people are still loading this other gun. They're going to notice that amount of black powder in the tray. And at the end of the day, if all that black powder somehow did spill out, hand waving it a little bit, and came into contact with an open flame, given that it's pouring, so it's uncontained and somewhat aerosolized, the result would probably be an explosion, or at least a very, very significant cook-off, as opposed to a bunch of smoke welling up, which everyone seems to miss for a little while, presumably on film director's orders, before going, hey, I wonder if the turret filling with loads of smoke is potentially an indication that something bad is going on, and then they notice there's a fire. But obviously, that's for safety reasons, well, because the US Navy isn't going to let them actually blow up a turret, and when you look at the way everything burns, it's fairly clear that whatever they are burning in there, it's not gunpowder. It's far less volatile than that. And it wouldn't surprise me that when, obviously, they're doing this sequence, although they are doing it in what appears to be the Arizona's turret, it wouldn't surprise me at all that the charge bags there are not in any way, shape or form live either, just in case. I mean, it's extremely unlikely a tiny little flare-up of the magnitude depicted in the film would have caused a charge bag several feet away to actually ignite, but it's never worth taking a risk. Rebel Squirrel asks, in order of importance, aside from the political issues that is, what were the chief limitations to the US Navy becoming larger and more powerful than it actually was in the early 19th century? Well, exactly how much importance you place on each of these factors is going to depend quite a bit on, what you think is most influential in terms of a country's power. So I'm going to list a few, and, well, you can order them pretty much as you like. The single biggest one for me is just sheer economy. The US economy in, well, let's take 1815 as an example year, because that's a reasonably good one to look at. The US economy in 1815 is 1/10 the size of the economy of the UK in terms of GDP. And that is just the UK, i.e. Scotland, Wales, and England. Ireland is counted separately in calculations at that point because there isn't a Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland at that point. It's just Ireland. And that's also not counting other money coming in from the British Empire. So, yeah, the US just doesn't have money. You think the economic disparity between Japan in the interwar period in World War II and the US was bad? The economic disparity between the US and the UK in 1815 is an order of magnitude worse. Now, granted, we are talking about the preeminent world power here compared to the US, but the Spanish and the French are, while not necessarily quite as wealthy as the UK, they're still roughly in that ballpark. They're not, an order of magnitude smaller, even without the rest of the empire being counted in. Then you've got the population, which, again, just looking at mainland Britain, the US population is smaller, and of course it's vastly more spread out, which tends to impede infrastructure and industry. Britain's advantage, at least in that time period, is that being relatively compact, lines of communication and supply are equally relatively small. And that brings us on to infrastructure. The US does have the capability of building a reasonable number of merchant ships and some warships, but it just doesn't have the sheer size and scope of infrastructure, both in terms of naval facilities and in terms of things like iron foundries for producing cannon and so on and so forth, that the larger nations in terms of naval strength like Spain and France and Britain can do. So while the US can afford to build a number of good frigates, and it can afford to build a handful of ships of the line, and in theory, if Congress wasn't cutting their budget all the time, they could even afford perhaps to maintain a single squadron of them, you're talking about the maximum effort of US naval capabilities at the time in terms of what you can actually construct, build, and economically maintain, let alone what Congress will let you do, essentially being a squadron of ships of the line with associated frigate support. And then you take into account that that squadron is just it. Whereas if you look at, say, Trafalgar or Cape St. Vincent or anything like that, those battles are fought by fleets which are made up of 6, 7, or 8 such squadrons, and those aren't even the entirety or even the majority of the fleets of both sides in question. So when the Battle of Trafalgar happens, yes, you have Nelson's fleet, but Nelson's fleet has essentially what would be the theoretical maximum ship-of-the-line capacity of the entire US Navy, if they went for it, off doing resupply in Gibraltar, while you also have Admiral Calder's fleet further north. You still have a fleet in the Channel, albeit some of its forces have been drawn off to support Calder. You've got various ships of the line scattered around the western part of the Atlantic, a few in the southern part of the Atlantic, some in the Indian Ocean, China Station, etc. You've got a bunch more ships of the line rotating through reserve and refit. You've got a bunch more ships of the line in Chatham and the North, in the sort of monitoring the North Sea, and so on and so forth. But yeah, essentially it comes down to, I think, lack of economy, lack of actual money. You know, if you put the same percentage of GDP towards the Navy as France, Spain, the UK, etc., you're going to end up with a much smaller Navy, and the infrastructure's not there to really build and supply a Navy that's much bigger than what was historically built and then almost immediately put into reserve anyway. So if you want a bigger Navy, you're going to have to grow your gun foundries, your naval yards, and your economy generally, and that probably means less westward expansion and more concentrating the population along the coastal cities, because the coastal cities, obviously, you can gather natural resources from the local area, you can gather resources from the Atlantic, and you can conduct trade. And the US actually had a fairly good trade network going prior to the War of 1812. It was kind of a third-party neutral carrier. And you obviously will still need some westward expansion to exploit more natural resources, but you will need to concentrate most of your population in the areas that are making the most money, because that will then allow you to grow everything else. Marlin Stout asks, given the German strategy of commerce warfare instead of trying to confront the Royal Navy directly, what would be the best raiding fleet that they could have designed? Would the Panzerschiff have been better if they'd been armed with 6-inch turrets as per the Königsbergs, 5.9-inch, or perhaps the Königsbergs built with the same machinery as used in the Panzerschiff? If their goal is to kill freighters, would a larger number of 6-inch guns be more useful than fewer 11-inch guns? And similarly, if they use diesel engines instead of steam in their destroyers, how would that affect the ship's speed and range? And would it have let them be better use in the open sea? Personally, I don't think diesel-powered destroyers would have done all that much for them, on two grounds. One, it's still a destroyer. It's still not going to have massive range. So yes, in theory, a diesel-powered destroyer might let you get your destroyer into the Atlantic, but you're not going to be staying in the Atlantic for very long. Now, granted, obviously, the Germans do have their resupply ships in the early part of the war that they could, in theory, refuel from. But for one thing, I really wouldn't want to be on a destroyer in World War II for weeks and weeks and weeks on end in the Atlantic. There are less pleasant ways to torture someone, but not many. And additionally, that kind of range, you're even with the big German destroyers, you're really looking at the tail end of German destroyer production and design. to get a diesel plant that would actually be useful, because remember, diesels, while they are long range, they are large and have a low power to weight ratio. That's one of the problems that the Panzerschiff have, why they have a limited speed. So you would need a very big destroyer with an awful lot of diesels in it and not a lot of space for much else in order to have destroyer-like speed plus range and so forth. So a lot of the smaller ships, I don't think, well, small relatively speaking, because a lot of German destroyers are still quite large, but a lot of their earlier destroyers I just don't think could fit a power plant that could tick all those boxes. I think they'd be much better off looking at cruiser level things. And when it comes down to that, Germany, I think, would have been probably one of the few instances, at least in the 1930s, where if you're aiming for a commerce raiding fleet, the cruiser carrier or battle carrier, depending on the scale of your ship, might actually be a viable solution. Because ultimately, look at the orders that German raiders had. In the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, they're not supposed to engage superior enemy forces or even equal enemy forces. Partly on the reasonable logic that if you're a raider and you get slightly damaged, that's it. Then there's a very low chance you're even going to get home. Whereas if you're a convoy escort and you get slightly damaged, well, there's going to be plenty more people to help you. So there is some logic to it, but the Germans did kind of go a little overboard with it. But assuming that for a moment that we're going to go with roughly the same rules of engagement, we don't want to engage a similar or superior force, at which point we don't want to really engage any force at all, really, because the Royal Navy has lots of cruisers it can put on convoy escort. So the only things we might want to engage would be destroyers, corvettes, sloops, that kind of stuff. At which point a large cruiser carrier actually makes sense, because you could armour such a thing against 4.5, 4.7 inch gunfire relatively easily. You don't need a huge amount of armour for that. You can then stick a bunch of guns on the front, or you could do it Graf Zeppelin style, but that's a little less efficient. So let's say on the front, and using your saved weight, you can make your ship very high speed, 35 knots or more, let's say. And then with the rest of it, you devote that to your hangar and your aircraft. Now, your air group isn't going to be huge, but it doesn't need to be. What you need is maybe half a dozen to a dozen long-range fighter scouts, and whatever else you can fit in there can be strike aircraft, and maybe the fighter scouts can carry some small bombs as well. Because then you cruise around, and if there's any enemy capital ship or cruiser around, well, you're fast enough to get away. With your aircraft, you're much more likely to spot the enemy generally, and also it helps you spot convoys because your search range is much expanded. And then you would, in theory, use your aircraft to primarily hit the convoy in the first place. So your scout fighters, etc., would hold position, pointing out where the enemy convoy is. You then launch your strike aircraft, and they damage, destroy, or drive off the escort, which probably isn't going to have the world's heaviest anti-aircraft firepower, at which point you move in with your actual ship, which also means the aircraft have less distance to come back to recover. And then you can use your guns and your high speed to hunt down the scattering convoy and destroy the merchantmen, and maybe one or two merchants get picked off by your aircraft as well. But your aircraft are primarily there to find the convoy and get rid of the convoy escorts, and look out for incoming cruisers or battleships and so forth, at which point you can just skedaddle again. And if there's a few escorts still around, well, if you're armoured against 4.7 inch gunfire and you've got 3 triple 5.9s or something, you can easily overwhelm the odd corvette or trawler or something like that. Ash the Lego guy asks, for the Kirov class cruisers, would putting in a delay so that the centre gun of each turret fires half a second or longer before firing the other two guns have improved the problem with blast interference and thus improved the ship's overall accuracy? It probably doesn't need to be half a second, but yes, delay coils were one of the things that was implemented in a lot of ships that had accuracy issues due to the guns being placed far too close together. And in some ships were actually implemented right from the start because they knew that otherwise they could have this problem. And I believe it was actually at least trialled with the Kirovs and potentially implemented across the fleet. I would have to double check that. So yes, it is definitely helpful. It's not going to solve the Kirov's guns issues in their entirety, because some of the issues are too small working space inside the turret, which is a significant factor to the long reload times, and also just the ridiculously high velocity nature of the guns, even once derated, and their short barrel life leading to whip and wear, and potentially also a relatively measurable difference in rifling between shots, all of which would not have helped with accuracy. But, delay coils can't hurt, and they would have helped somewhat. Tankodromis asks, during World War I, the W class of destroyers in the Royal Navy used triple torpedo tubes in a pyramid configuration with one tube atop the other two. Why was this configuration abandoned in later years? With quintuple torpedo tubes, this pyramid style would need less deck space with 3 tubes and then 2 on top. Was there a problem with a higher centre of gravity or something else? There are a few different issues with having the kind of pyramidal torpedo launcher style, which you can see here on one of the V-class. The main advantage is a relatively minimal increase in the use of deck space, and this was important on the V and W class because the early V-class had twin launchers, and the later V-class and then most of the W-class had these triple launchers. And one of the useful features was that because they didn't take up all that much deck space, it meant that you could mount them on ships that had previously had just twin launchers without needing to extend the space where you were placing said launchers. So as a nice compact design, that was good. But yes, they were a bit more top heavy. Granted, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but every ton that's another foot or two above the waterline counts when you're on a destroyer. And also it makes the actual mounting pedestal itself somewhat more top heavy, which isn't good when the ship's rocking side to side. Another problem is that, as you can see here, when they're reloading the tube, if you have your torpedo tube at roughly chest level, loading it is one thing. If you're having to load it above head height, although you're obviously using mechanical aids all the time, that makes reloading somewhat more complex. And then at the other end of things, when you're actually launching them, you have the problem of, if you're trying to launch lots of torpedoes all at once, i.e. a full spread, if you've got a side-by-side set of launchers, you can just ripple fire them. If you've got this pyramidal style, you have to be very careful how you launch them, because otherwise you could run into problems with perhaps a torpedo that you've launched from one of the upper tubes impacting a torpedo that's being launched or has been launched from one of the lower tubes on its way down. And of course the torpedoes, because they're being launched from different heights, are going to enter the water at slightly different angles, and you're going to have to compensate for that in your launching mechanism, which might mean you might need a slightly more powerful charge, for example, in the upper tubes. And as you can actually see here, there is still a bit of spacing between the lower two tubes, so while you are saving some deck space, you're not saving a huge amount of deck space relative to all the negatives that we've just covered. It also complicates things for maintenance, because if you actually have to do some maintenance on the tube itself and the associated launch mechanisms on a flat style launcher, then each tube is essentially accessible from above, below, and in some cases to the side. Whereas in the pyramidal style, if something's gone wrong with one of those lower two tubes on their inner sides or the underside of the upper tube, it's going to be very, very difficult to access those bits, which is going to make maintenance a bit more of a nightmare. So if you're looking for a very compact type of launcher to fit on a very small ship, then sure, go for a pyramidal torpedo launcher. But if you have the deck space and you want to launch 3, 4, or 5 torpedoes, it's probably better to go for a flat style launcher. Killer Rabbit asks, why were flying boats so common before World War II? Was building runways that expensive? To a degree, yes, but also you had a problem of essentially the same kind of thing the French Navy was facing, infrastructure expansion, because the size and capability of aircraft, and related to that obviously their takeoff and landing distances, was expanding very, very rapidly in the interwar period. So some of the earliest airliners, for example, in the immediate post-World War I period, because, well, Pre-World War One airliner services, yeah, let's not go there. But post-war, you're looking at some aircraft which are actually smaller, dimensionally and weight-wise, than a World War II Avenger bomber. And they're also biplanes with, a cruising speed that's only barely over 100 miles an hour. And then as you go through into the mid and late 1920s, you start to see more and more twin and three-engine aircraft coming in, and size starts to go up to the point where you're talking about aircraft about the size of a World War II medium bomber. And then as you transition through into the 1930s, you start to see particularly an improvement in performance, mostly because you start to see a move from fabric and canvas and biplanes over to metal and monoplanes. So, for example, the DC-3 dimensionally is not all that much off of an Argosy, but performance-wise is far, far superior. And, of course, with all of that comes the need for a greater runway length, an actual runway instead of a smooth piece of grass, and so on and so forth. The problem then becomes if you want to go a really long way, like transatlantic, for example, you're going to need probably a four-engined aircraft, not just because you need four engines to haul an aircraft of the size that's big enough to carry enough fuel and enough passengers to make the transatlantic crossing both possible and worthwhile, but you've also got redundancy, which is something that featured even well into the modern jet era. Part of the reason for the 3 and 4 engine jetliners like the 747, the DC-10 or the A340 was simply because there was a risk you might lose an engine and you needed to be able to make it to land on 2 or 3 engines, depending on if you had 3 or 4 to start with. Nowadays, reliability and power output of engines has gotten to the point where you now have twin-engine aircraft like the A350 or the 787 or the 777, which can do transatlantic or trans-Pacific on 2, but that's a completely separate issue. But way back then, a combination of power output, redundancy, and size meant you were going to have at least 4 engines if you were going to go across the Atlantic. And an aircraft of that size and scale needed a bigger airfield to handle it, which was obviously then A, more expensive to build, and B, if you already had a pre-existing airfield, expanding it might not be possible because infrastructure tends to go up around airfields, and if you wanted to avoid that, dodge it, etc., obviously that was all quite expensive. And then you have added issues, like if you have multiple engine failures or some other kind of catastrophe going on that's not immediately fatal to the aircraft. If you have a wheeled aircraft that's designed to operate from land-based runways and you're over the Atlantic, well, if you ditch, your chances of survival aren't great. Even if everyone survives the landing, the aircraft's going to sink pretty quickly. Whereas with a flying boat, not only did you not have to have a big, long, expensive runway for a very small number of aircraft that would just be doing the long routes, because let's face it, they're not going to be doing the internal routes because the demand might not be there, and even if the demand is there, the other airports internally might not have expanded to meet that demand. So you don't need a lot of infrastructure. You can reuse a lot of existing maritime infrastructure, and if anything does go really dramatically wrong in flight, a flying boat, well, clues in the name, it can just land. And assuming the landing goes relatively well and you're not caught in a massive storm, you can remain afloat for quite a while you either try and work out what's gone wrong and fix it, or wait for someone to come rescue you. And that did actually happen a few times. Even during one of the US Navy's fleet problems, a passenger flying boat went down and the exercise was briefly suspended to go and look for it and rescue everybody who was on board. And when you have effectively unlimited landing space in the form of the sea, it also meant that aircraft could grow very, very large very, very quickly instead of the incremental steps that you'd need for a land-based aircraft, mostly because of the infrastructure limitations. And you can see that with the late 1930s, the size of flying boats and their capacity was rapidly outpacing the size and capacity of the prototype 4-engine land-based transports. And the other thing is also just speed of setup. Airliners were expanding very aggressively in the 1930s, and that meant that if you wanted to open a new route, well, if you had a flying boat and there was a nearby patch of water, you could open the new route almost immediately. If you wanted to use a land-based aircraft, then you had to go through all the rigmarole of setting up a suitable airport, which would leave you at a disadvantage versus your competitors. Once World War II kicked off, however, with the needs of, well, both air forces generally, but particularly long-range coastal patrol aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, and bombers, suddenly there was a massive amount of ready-built, long, high-capacity and sturdy runways, and as well as obviously a massive development in the technology of aircraft, and suddenly you could have a safe, reliable four-engine land-based aircraft that could go from point to point because you had all the infrastructure set up and ready to go, and it was pretty cheap. And of course, now being able to go on land meant you could go more places than just the coast, and suddenly flying boats became less attractive. Jack Hirsch asks, I read somewhere that at Normandy, USS Texas flooded her starboard torpedo blister, giving her a 2-degree list for additional range. Was this true, and how much additional range did it give her? It is absolutely true. Texas did do this. However, when you look at the timing of it, what you'll see is some people incorrectly will say, Texas did this at D-Day. No, she did not. Texas did do this during what you might term the D-Day campaign or the Normandy campaign, but on D-Day her targets were rather close and therefore did not in any way, shape or form even need the full elevation of her guns, let alone flooding for additional range. It was towards the tail end of what you might term the D-Day or Normandy campaign, once Allied armies had started to advance a fair distance inland and new targets were getting beyond the range of her guns at maximum elevation, which also, just fundamentally makes a lot more sense when you stop to think about it. And in terms of that range, it's actually fairly easy to work out, luckily, because the New York class, of which Texas is one, used the same guns as the Nevada and Pennsylvania classes, with one rather important difference, which is that the Texas's guns, as far as I'm aware, were never modified to be able to fire above 15-degree elevation, whereas the others were either originally built as or later modified to be able to fire up to 30 degrees elevation. So we don't need to guess at the range, we just need to look at the range tables for example, the Nevada's twin 14-inch turrets, which are essentially identical to the ones on Texas, only with more elevation. Now, of course, it does depend on what shell you're using. Are you firing at a target with your AP shell, which has a slightly shorter range than your high-capacity shell at these elevations? So at maximum gun elevation of 15 degrees, the AP shell on Texas would reach out to about 23,000 yards, add another 500 or so for the high-capacity shell. And the extra 2 degrees of elevation is going to add about 2,000 to 2,500 yards to your overall range. So with your high-capacity shell, you're going to hit 25,500 yards or so. With the AP shell, probably about 25,000 yards. So it's adding a little over a mile to the range of your guns. Samuel G. Gurley asks, why did torpedo bombers have 3 aircrew while dive bombers only had 2? Now, although it's not universally true, because you do have a few 1- or 2-seat torpedo bombers as well, and I'm not even talking about post-World War II or late World War II, early 1920s ones occasionally were 1- or 2-seaters, generally speaking, it was a combination of the method of attack with a torpedo as opposed to a bomb, as well as the size of the aircraft. Now, what I mean by that is that a torpedo, even a relatively speaking lightweight aerial torpedo, still weighs an awful lot more than the bombs that most carrier-based attack aircraft were expected to be hauling around for the majority of the interwar period. So most bombers or dive bombers would expect to haul around a 250-pound or 500-pound bomb. If you're hauling a 250, maybe a couple of them. The idea of hauling a 1,000-pounder is sort of mid to late 1930s idea, somewhat late in the game. And even against an aircraft that can carry a 1,000-pounder, your typical aerial torpedo is, roughly speaking, 2,500 pounds, plus or minus a little bit. So you're going to need a substantially more powerful and therefore substantially larger aircraft, for the most part, to carry a torpedo. If you're making a larger, more powerful aircraft, then thanks to the square cube law, it also means you're going to be able to carry significantly more fuel, and that also means you're going to have a fairly long-range aircraft. So if you have a long-ranged aircraft for your torpedo bomber, then you're probably going to need some form of navigator, and at the time most navies reckoned that if you were indeed going to do long-range navigation, that had to be a role separate from the pilots. Now, where you did have, a one-seater, essentially fighter torpedo bomber, the main thing was, well, their range wasn't that great, so it didn't matter as much. You just turn back roughly in the direction you'd come from and hopefully land up vaguely in the direct area where the carrier should be. Whereas if you're going to go hundreds of miles in a big torpedo bomber, then you definitely do need a navigator to get you home safely. A dive bomber, meanwhile, only having to carry a relatively limited payload, could be a smaller aircraft and therefore potentially shorter range, and therefore would probably not need the services of a navigator. And if in a pinch they did need the services of a navigator, then perhaps the rear gunner, which was needed as a defensive installation, could suffice. However, if we go back to our big torpedo bomber, you also need a rear gunner, so you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, surely the rear gunner, like with a dive bomber, could double up as a navigator. Well, there's another problem there, and that is the torpedo itself. You see, if you are dive bombing, then all the equipment and markings to allow you to dive bomb successfully are for the pilot. The pilot has to direct the aircraft to drop the bomb. It's all there ready for him. So if the pilot's doing the flight and the attack profile, then the tail gunner can do the gunner position and, if necessary, the navigation. However, with a torpedo bomber, the torpedo attack profile requires somebody to be essentially looking underneath the aircraft and directing you, left a bit, right a bit, up a bit, down a bit, and then perfectly timing the torpedo release. A pilot who is positioned on top of the aircraft can't do that. So you need somebody who's going to be able to position themselves underneath the pilot to do that, i.e. a bombardier or a torpedo aimer. But there's also a chance that you're going to be attacked while you're doing this, because enemy fleets don't really like people coming after them with torpedoes. I mean, can you imagine the scenes, pilot desperately holding his aircraft low and slow, trying to think about lining his torpedo run up, and he's like, "Oi, mate," to the rear gunner, "can you come forward and, aim the torpedo for me?" And the gunner's like, "I'm sorry, I'm a little busy trying to keep us alive," as he fights off a horde of enemy fighters. It's not going to work, is it? So if you've got a big aircraft, well, you have your third crewman, who is your bombardier, who can slide forward and aim the torpedo while the rear gunner tries to keep you alive, and the pilot keeps the plane going roughly in the direction it should be, while all the time, assuming you survive it, you also have a dedicated navigator who's able to not only get you to the location where you're supposed to make the torpedo attack in the first place, but can also hopefully get you home again. Silder and Machine Works asks, "You've previously said the explosion of the French ship of the line L'Orient at the Battle of the Nile so stunned everyone who witnessed it that the battle paused for a short time. How frequent were magazine explosions in the Age of Sail? Did that differ from the Age of Steam and Steel, and what factors made the difference in frequency?" Magazine explosions weren't unknown in the Age of Sail, but they were relatively infrequent and usually not at the kind of scale you saw with L'Orient for a few different reasons. I mean, the fact that the battle and L'Orient's explosion took place in darkness obviously amplified the visual effect of the explosion. But you also have to consider a few other things. Firstly, L'Orient was a large first rate, so she would be carrying a lot more gunpowder than your average ship of the line, which was a third rate, and considerably more than a frigate. And the vast majority of magazine explosions, which, as I said, were still relatively uncommon in the Age of Sail, were frigates and smaller ships, usually when they were being burned after having been captured, if they had been assessed that it wasn't worth bringing this ship back as a prize. Very occasionally a ship of the line would catch fire and burn and explode as well. But in all of those cases, not only would you started out with a lesser amount of gunpowder, but a good chunk of that would probably have been expended in battle, so the remaining amount would be smaller still. And if a ship has been burning for a prolonged period in battle, everyone will have gotten out of the way, and more commonly, if the ship's been set on fire in the aftermath of a battle, it's probably had its gunpowder stores looted of some useful powder, so even less still available, and the ship that set it on fire will have been making haste to get out of range. So when the explosion happens, it will be smaller and further away. Whereas when L'Orient cooks off, because of the situation of the French fleet before the battle, she hasn't expended a huge amount of powder, and as I said, she has a huge amount on board. It's night time, and on top of all of that, as the fire that she will eventually destroy her catches hold and starts to really build, everyone knows what's going to happen. So it's not like this is a completely unknown thing. They're seeing this guy and they're like, the magazine's going to cook off, this is really bad. But because of the low amount of wind and the fact that most ships have dropped anchors on both sides to fight, they all know there's pretty much no way they're going to get away in time. And of course, the fight's happening at really close range. So in the last few minutes of L'Orient's life, what you actually see on both sides is everybody frantically battening down hatches and gun ports and soaking sails and pouring water everywhere, because they're just like, this is bad, this is bad, this is really, really, really bad. We're about to have, probably the single largest concentration of gunpowder outside of a gunpowder mill cook-off, and we're 150 yards away, and then it cooks off. So, yeah, the effect of a much larger amount of gunpowder than average going off at night, essentially almost in your face, is going to be psychologically massively, massively more effective than 1/10 that amount going off 3 miles away in daylight. But with that said, outside of a ship catching fire in total, magazine explosions were actually very rare in the Age of Sail, partly because, well, with a wooden ship, everyone is absolutely paranoid about the risk of fire generally, and with gunpowder being a fairly volatile substance, they're extra paranoid about magazine precautions. And that's one of the things that's occasionally attributed to steam and steel era explosions in magazines, is that because the newer propellants are so much more stable and so much, therefore, theoretically safer as far as explosives go than black powder, people got a little bit more relaxed because you didn't need the hyper-paranoid nature of the black powder magazine precautions. And then it turned out that perhaps that wasn't such a bad idea after all. The other problem, which was a major contributory cause to most of the big magazine explosions in the Age of Steam and Steel, not counting for things caused by enemy action like Hood or Arizona, is that black powder, at least by the time of the classic Age of Sail, tends to be relatively stable in terms of if you store it in a cool, dry environment, it's probably going to stay as it is for a good while. In the early 20th century, however, as they'd moved from black powder to gun cotton and then on to cordite, melanite, and various permutations thereof, the stability of the explosives was actually quite bad, and they would degrade into far more sensitive and volatile forms relatively quickly. The French explosive was the worst for it, and British early cordite was not far behind. And obviously, if you have an explosive that, if you store it in a cool, dry environment, will turn into something considerably more volatile in the space of a few years, that is inherently far, far more dangerous than black powder, which, well, if you store it in a decent, cool, dry environment and you come back a few years later, it's probably still just going to be regular black powder. And when I say more volatile, we're talking, as I've mentioned before, degrading into things like nitroglycerin crystals, which are then very, very contact or shock sensitive, which black powder really isn't. Chief Eyeroll asks, can you discuss the Regia Marina's destroyer transport operations during the Tunisian campaign? What were notable successes by these flotillas, and did the Regia Marina modify these ships for this mission? How did their mission contrast to the IJN's operations in the Solomons? So the Regia Marina's destroyer transport operations were a subset of their convoy supply operations. And no, they didn't usually modify the destroyers for those missions, in large part because the destroyers were supposed to be able to go straight back into combat operations as soon as the mission was completed, either generally supporting the fleet or running more conventional escort for regular transport ships, which was another part, obviously, of the whole supply operation. And they also wanted the destroyers to be able to fight back if they did come under attack. Now, the reason that they actually undertook these in the first place initially was due to the rather rapid changes in the North African campaign, and they just needed troops and equipment there right this instant. And, well, destroyers are considerably faster than merchant ships, and with the relatively short distances that the convoys had to cover, it was possible to load a bunch of troops up onto the destroyers, and the destroyer could then crank their engines up to not necessarily absolute full speed, but near full speed, and go zipping along, deliver the men, and be back again within a day or so. But as the convoys between Italy and North Africa continued, and they thought, oh, well, things are a little bit more sedate now, the front line's a little bit more stable, we'll try and move convoys in, or troops in troop transport convoys, because you can put a lot more equipment and a lot more troops on a big merchant ship than you can on a destroyer. Except then you had a bunch of attacks like the Torigo convoy and the Espero convoy, Torigo convoy especially, and it turns out, well, if you pack several thousand troops into a troop transport that can't run away from British destroyers, and the British destroyers sink it, that's an awful lot of troops and equipment you've lost all in one go, which was also very similar to the Japanese experience in the Guadalcanal and Solomons campaigns, except with mostly American air power and submarines rather than American surface ships. And so the Italians thought, okay, well, if we're going to move equipment and supplies in bulk, we still have to use merchant ships for that. But, albeit within the scope of the Italian economy, those things could be replaced if they are sunk. Troops, especially experienced and trained troops, not so much. And so to move the Italian troops, they started employing whole destroyer divisions, and they'd load them up onto the destroyers, several hundred troops per destroyer, with their essentially portable equipment, basic field rations, rifles, etc., and some of the lighter field equipment, so light anti-tank guns and mortars, things like that. And then a destroyer division would zip across, and obviously being able to move a lot faster, could get those troops delivered very quickly, and potentially could do 2 or 3 runs in the time that it would take a conventional convoy to do the same kind of travel. And it's much more secure because obviously the destroyers are moving quicker, so they're exposed for less time. They're much more able to defend themselves, both in terms of direct gunfire and escape and evasion. And in cold ruthlessness, at the end of the day, even if the convoy does get intercepted by a superior British force and they can't do much to escape, any one destroyer that is sunk isn't going to take as many troops with it as a full-size troop transport would have. The main success of these flotilla missions was mostly in the fact that most of them weren't intercepted, or if the interceptions did occur, they didn't work very well. So the Italians lost very, very few troops out of all the troops that they were transporting. Now, compared to the Japanese Navy, they did have a few advantages. Firstly, they had actual port facilities to unload in. Secondly, aerial and sea dominance in the central Mediterranean was a lot more contested than it was in the waters off Guadalcanal, for instance, where it was essentially the Japanese dominate the night, the Americans dominate the day for most of the campaign. And most of the time, the distance they had to travel was either slightly less, and then as things moved further and further westward in the North Africa campaign, eventually considerably less than what the IJN had to travel to get to the northwestern tip of Guadalcanal. So that meant travelling under cover of night to avoid the worst of Allied air attacks for the Italians occupied a greater portion of their trip, perhaps even the entire trip, one leg there and then one leg back. They had a lot more friendly air cover while they were unloading, and as I said, because they're unloading in actual port facilities, it was much easier to get men and supplies off and anything that needed to come back to Italy back on, and then they could head off again. And that meant they didn't have to do silly things like, chucking supplies into the sea and hoping that tide and inertia would take them ashore. Salam in Shakia 93 asks, what was the thought process of the Royal Navy in the changing of the bows of their cruisers and capital ships from inverted bows in the late Victorian era to S-shaped profiles like the Renowns and the early C class, to clipper bows like Hood, straight-raked bows like the G3s, Nelsons, etc., and the trawler bows in later World War I cruisers and onwards, while their destroyers only had plumb, straight, or raked bows? Also, if the trawler bows helped the cruisers with seakeeping, why didn't the King George V's have them? So, when it comes to the trawler bows specifically, for the King George V's, they weren't considered necessary because the King George V's bows are somewhat fuller than the cruisers' bows, and in addition to that, the King George V's weren't expected to go as fast, so they didn't need quite the same amount of deflection of water. The main problem with the King George V seakeeping was the fact the bows were flat and not, raking upwards, which, a trawler bow wouldn't have helped all that much with, to be perfectly honest. Now, as far as the general bow trend, the inverted bows of the late Victorian era are very much an artifact of the fact there's an underwater ram, so it's all going in to support that, and also just the fact they're not moving particularly quickly. Capital ships are moving in the mid to high teens, cruisers are moving in the low 20s of knots, and then as speed picks up, therefore the bow wave increases, therefore you need new types of bow, both to assist with just moving quickly generally, efficiently, and also to try and keep the water away from your upper deck. So you'll start to see an increase in freeboard on the bow, so the bow will be higher, and as the ram starts to disappear, you'll start to see a bow that is more and more aimed towards specifically seakeeping. So, like you can see here with Renown in her earlier form, you have this kind of slightly clipper-like bow, i.e. the very tip of the bow up top is slightly forward of the basic stem, but this is for a ship that is more designed for high top speed. So this is what you termed in the question the S-shaped profile. Hood, of course, is bigger and also going very quickly, so it's going with the classic speed bow, the clipper bow. And then as you move forward into the interwar and World War II period, it's all a function of speed. So the G3 class actually has a relatively raked bow, but this is a little reduced on the Nelsons, although not by too much. But that's because obviously the G3s are a little bit faster, so they need a little bit more allowance for a high bow wave, but also you've still got this requirement of almost dead ahead firing, which is influencing the upper shape of the bow, and also the hull form, because if you look at a top-down view or a ortho view, you'll see the shape of the Nelson and the G3 bows as compared to some other battleships' bows, particularly in the way of the rake and the swell of the hull, is, a very different thing from a Colorado or a Nagato, and therefore the requirements that you need at the tip of that bow are different from what you'd find on other ships. The trawler bow is put in on cruisers because it essentially allows you to deflect a whole bunch of water from either pitching or the bow wave away without having a massively flared bow up front, which is very important for treaty-era ships especially, but cruisers in general as well, because you don't really want a huge amount of top weight if you can avoid it. And on destroyers, a basic slight forward rake and hull flare was considered to be all you need to deflect the bow wave, as you can see here being done rather successfully by HMS Imogen. And that's pretty much until you get to the tribal class, and then with the tribal class and the follow-on ships, which are all considerably larger ships than most of the interwar British destroyer efforts, then you see an even more heavily raked, almost clipper-like forward bow with a very deep hull flare, in part because you've got the size of ship to be able to afford it, and in part because obviously being bigger ships, they're going to be throwing more water out of the way, which means that even for the same speed, there's going to be more volume of water in the bow wave, which means you need more deflection capability. And also, again, at the smaller destroyer sizes, what you can see here is pretty much all you need, because any further efforts to try and make the bow more buoyant and control pitching, etc., it's not really going to work on a hull that size. But when you're talking about a tribal class and later hull, well, those hulls are big enough, A, that the problem could be more severe, and B, that you have the hull volume for more mitigation. Manani Wanderer asks, Sea Shanties, how did they develop, and when would the more well-known ones like Drunken Sailor and Wellerman have been sung? True sea shanties, as opposed to just maritime-based folk songs, developed in the Age of Sail, when you had large ships with significant crews and various tasks that needed a significant number of men to get in sync to carry it out properly. And one of the easiest ways of doing that was to come up with a form of rhythm-based song, which everyone could know, and also which you could invent lots of lyrics for. So it'd have a fairly simple beat, a fairly simple structure, and then that meant that you didn't have to keep repeating the same verse over and over again. If you were conducting a fairly repetitive task, you could have someone just invent new verses with the same chorus or refrain line, which was the bit that the actual work would take place on, for the most part, because there were lots of different types of sea shanty developed for different kinds of activity aboard a ship. Because, for example, let's say if you were hoisting the sails, as in you're bringing the sails up to the yard and the yard arm, that requires lots of sharp, very, if you like, powerful movements. You're putting your back into it, but you're doing it at a fairly repetitive, quick basis. And so for that, you would want a sea shanty that has a fairly steady, ongoing beat to it, but with the definite rises. So as you'd go through it, that each time the beat rises, that would be the cue for everyone to haul up. And a lot of the times, the sea shanties would be what you would call call and response songs. So there might be a continuing refrain through the shanty, and you would have someone who's perhaps very good at improvising lines go through the non-repeating lines, and then when you get to the common section, that's when everyone does the bit of work and they all respond with the chorus. But there could be other activities like trying to change course, moving masts around, hauling up anchors, not using a capstan, or hauling up boats or something. And in those cases, rather than short, sharp movements, you would need a few really big pulls on a rope, and then you'd need to catch your breath for a little bit, and obviously be doing this in a group activity. So something like Drunken Sailor is actually quite good for that. I mean, as I said, different shanties used for different methods, but something like the Drunken Sailor actually works quite well, although it is a bit of a multi-purpose one there, because you could have somebody do, what we'll do with the Drunken Sailor. That's repeated a couple of times. That gives everyone a chance to, recover their breath. And then you have, put him in a longboat till he's sober. And at the end of that line, everyone gives a big haul. So you repeat that line 3 times. So that's 3 big hauls. And then you've basically got an equal amount of time while the call element of the call and response does another 3 verses, and then a 3-verse reply, 3 more hauls. But the reason why that's multi-purpose is because it's got a very repetitive structure to it. You could just have everybody singing it, and at the end of each of the lines, you do a shorter haul or a step or something, depending on what activity you're doing. Spanish Ladies is a fairly famous sea shanty as well, so that's actually a really good example of something you use for hauling up a capstan, because you have a relatively short verse that would be perhaps the call element, and then a fairly extensive verse that is the response, or the main chorus, if you like. And again, if you imagine you're pushing a capstan, think about, or maybe even sing the chorus to Spanish Ladies, and you notice you're not massively exhausting your lungs when you're doing it, and it has a rhythm to it where if you imagine you're pressing against a capstan bar and everyone's taking steps forward, it works at just the right pace. Something like Wellerman is verging more towards a folk song, but more of a mercantile sea shanty. But if you listen to the beat and the chorus, you get actually a fairly good feeling of what it would be useful for. So again, it would make a fairly good hauling shanty for hauling on lines. So you'd have the initial verses, that's your pausing period. Then you have the Wellerman chorus, and at the end of each line in the chorus, that's when you give a big tug on the ropes. But if you're just singing the whole thing through, if you listen to the beat, especially in the renditions where someone is actually just doing the beat on a drum or a bit of wood or something, that kind of fast, quick beat that's consistent throughout the song would be really good as what they call a hand-over-hand shanty. So that would be for when you're just hauling in slack rope or light hauling. So not when you're trying to set an entire mast and sail set, but perhaps small trims on the sails, bringing up lines, that kind of stuff. It makes a good shanty for that. And the best shanties are this kind of dual purpose thing where you can use it for multiple different kinds of tasks. The Freaker 86 asks, how long did it take to cook up a good design plan from scratch for a battleship in the 1930s and during World War II? And then how long did it take to build one after the design work was completed? Typically, a battleship of the fast battleship era, the 1930s, would take about 3 to 3.5 years between keel laying and commission, with it usually taking around about 2 years to go from keel laying to launch, and then a year to a year and a half to commission. And give or take a few months either side of that, that is generally what you will see across the board, unless there's some really good reason for that not to be the case, like there's constant stop-start work on Vanguard, or ships that are built entirely under wartime conditions, which can either be very much slower or very much faster, depending on whether it's being more disrupted by labour shortages and bombing, or accelerated by people piling all the money and labour at them. And typically, if you're starting from scratch, it took about 2, maybe 2.5 years to actually design a battleship. If you look at the North Carolinas, the Richelieus, the King George V, the ones where they are pretty much starting from scratch, it usually takes them around about a year to go through all the various design options and settle on a rough form that is, recognisably what would eventually be launched. And then it takes them another year or so to refine that down from kind of, this is the winner of our design iterations, through to not only do we know exactly what it's going to look like, but also here's all the drawings ready to go. And then, admittedly, in the 1930s, there is some design revision still going on while the ships are under construction after they've been ordered. But broadly speaking, the bulk of the design work is done within about 2, maybe 2.5 years, depending on the people in question. Of course, once you get closer and closer to wartime and you start to see more iterative designs, that process can accelerate quite considerably. So even though there's quite a range of designs looked at for the Iowas, because they have the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas to work from already in terms of a lot of equipment and layout, etc., the design process for the Iowas is cut down to about a year, and that essentially is a very, very accelerated consideration of options period, and then the majority of the time is just spent refining what's been selected from that consideration of options. Lieutenant William Bush asks, the USS Massachusetts fired almost everything it had at the invasion of North Africa, and at a wide variety of ranges and targets. What do you think of its overall accuracy and performance? For what she was at the time, which bear in mind Massachusetts at this point is a essentially brand new ship, she's just commissioned and this is her first operational deployment, near enough, she does exceptionally well, because if you like, green ship with the new paint smell still hanging around, really you shouldn't expect all that much of her. But at the same time, obviously, she does get quite a few decent hits in. She is let down by several faults in her ammunition with a number of hits, but in terms of overall accuracy of guns and so forth, she does remarkably well. And actually, in some ways, there's some strong parallels to Prince of Wales at Battle of Denmark Strait, because she is also a brand new ship with a relatively green crew aboard, but also does a fairly creditable job in gunnery terms. She does have jams and failures, of course, but remember, Prince of Wales is the first ship to hit Bismarck, she's the first ship to find range, etc. And Massachusetts is in a similar boat, quite literally. She scores hits on a variety of French targets, or Vichy French targets, and manages to keep herself mostly intact. There is one or two hits. You can obviously have a look at the remnants of those on board Massachusetts these days up at Battleship Cove. There are a few minor nitpicks I would make about her performance in general, but that's not so much to do with her shooting, it's more to do with her record keeping, because if you try and make the various logs kept aboard Massachusetts make sense, it doesn't work. You know, you've got one log that gives you courses and speeds and ranges and so forth, and you've got another log that also gives you courses and speeds and ranges, and if you actually plot the two out, they don't agree in the slightest. I mean, admittedly, one of them is just the general deck log, and, you know, some orders probably would have been missed, which explains some of the divergence, but also internally, when you look at the what the course changes and speeds say, and therefore where the ship should be, versus what the gunnery ranges are saying where the ship is, there's clearly a fairly major discrepancy going on, because, you know, if you were to believe both logs put in parallel, you'd have literally the ranges from one log match the other log better, but the second log's gun ranges don't match either log particularly well at all. But the first log is the one that has more detail in it. So clearly, the crew had some work to do when it came to working out where exactly they were, but the gunnery crews, in terms of sending shells over to hit other things, were doing a much better job. Brad in SoCal asks, admin question, the drydocks often refer to guide number whatever. However, there are so many I'm completely lost. Would you consider creating playlists by either country or vessel type so we can binge listen to a set of guides? Well, if you go to the channel page and scroll to the bottom, there's a recommended playlist section, but there's also a created playlists section right at the bottom. If you click on that, that'll bring you to a page that looks like this, and that actually has already a bunch of playlists I've already created. You can see there are museum ships, various ship types, a couple of playlists I've made for certain miniseries like the War of 1812. Obviously, I don't know what particular order they're displayed in, but the lower down you can see there's like battle cruisers, submarines, aircraft carriers, etc. So if you want to listen through like that, you can do so. There's even a French battleships one where I realised I'd actually covered every class of French battleship, at least the more modern ones, the dreadnoughts. So I put them in their own little one there, although they will also appear in the battleships list. Now, admittedly, some of these playlists are quite long. There's 105 videos in naval engineering, 84 in battles at sea, and so on and so forth. But there's a certain number of playlists you could watch there. Now, I do need to curate a few of them, maybe make sure videos are in the right order and so forth. But if you have suggestions on particular playlists you'd like in addition to these, then please obviously either let me know in the comments below or email me or DM me on Discord, etc. And I can look into setting up some rather specific ones if you'd like. Especially now, I think I've covered every dreadnought class, so I could set up a British dreadnoughts, American dreadnoughts, or battleships, whatever you want to call it, etc. for the different nations, the way I did with the French ones. Paul from Chicago asks, what was the perception in the late 1910s through the 20s and early 30s on the effectiveness of seaplane carriers and tenders versus aircraft carriers? For example, when Langley was converted from a small aircraft carrier to seaplane tender, was it seen as a one-for-one trade-off with little loss in overall force capacity? To be honest, by the time Langley was converted to a seaplane tender, she wasn't really seen as a frontline combat effective carrier anymore. I mean, Ranger, for all her faults, is considerably more capable than Langley, and the US Navy had some big question marks over whether Ranger should be put on frontline duty. So when she was turned into a seaplane carrier, it was seen more of a win, just generally, because it freed up the tonnage that Langley had been occupying under the treaty system to be used on another carrier, and it also meant there wouldn't be the temptation to try and use her on the front lines, and, well, a new seaplane tender was always useful. Now, as far as the sort of 20-year period you mentioned from maybe the end of the First World War through to the early 30s, it was acknowledged that aircraft carriers were generally a more useful thing than seaplane carriers and tenders, albeit the seaplane carriers and tenders were far less regulated by treaty, because obviously aircraft carriers could carry more aircraft, they could carry a wider variety of aircraft, and of course they had a far more effective offensive capability rather than your seaplane carriers or tenders, which could either carry or support a handful of aircraft that weren't particularly suited to an attack role anyway. But it was held that seaplane carriers and tenders, by supporting these much larger float planes and flying boats, were potentially much better long-term recon assets, and also much better at setting up existing or long-term existing recon bases. So what I mean by that is that a carrier, by its nature, tends to have to stay mobile, to stay operational. So you could fan out 24 or so scout aircraft from a carrier, but being single-engine aircraft, they have a limited range. The carrier is going to be constantly moving, so the carrier can search an area very well, and then it has to move on. And that area is going to be limited in radius. Whereas a seaplane tender or seaplane carrier, certainly in the US conception of things, and to a certain extent even the Japanese as well, they were looking, and you see this in the fleet problems, more at deploying to an atoll or an island or somewhere with a natural harbour, and then acting as essentially a base ship, and obviously a multi-engined flying boat or seaplane could go a lot further, conduct patrols for a lot longer, and therefore cover a wider area than carrier-based aircraft could. And by essentially being just a fuel and munitions and food depot, it meant that your now relatively stationary seaplane carrying or tendering vessel could support ongoing recon from that area for weeks or months at a time, which meant you'd have a permanent reconnaissance presence in the area that you'd chosen, as opposed to a carrier where, at best a couple of weeks later you'd have to drop back at least for refueling, if not RTB entirely. So essentially for mobile fleet actions, the carrier was far more capable because it could go places faster, it could more thoroughly search a slightly smaller area, and it had the offensive capability as well as the defensive capability of its fighters. But if you wanted to set up a kind of a recon barrier, a tripwire or monitoring, or even a safety zone against submarines and so forth, then a seaplane carrier or tender was seen as a better bet. DM Phoenix asks, how were submarine crush depth values calculated in the period that the channel covers? Did various naval powers produce sacrificial hulls to confirm the absolute limits of their submarine hull strengths, or was a red line entirely conjecture? It varies a little bit in the time period the channel covers. Very early on, and to a surprising extent even during the 1910s, there wasn't really all that much point in calculating crush depth, because a submarine would be irrevocably destroyed and put in permanently sinking condition long before it reached any theoretical crush depth, because you would have things like the strength perhaps of your torpedo tubes, and how much pressure can they withstand when you open the doors, or various fixtures and fittings, hatches and perhaps even the riveting, valves and so forth. So there was a fairly good chance that with the very, very early submarines, your limits were, well, when does the leaking through these things become fatal, rather than you've reached crush depth. As you go through the 1910s and then into the 1920s, crush depths become a little bit more relevant because those various seals and so forth now become strong enough to actually get down to a depth where actually the hull beginning to buckle might be a problem. Now, it was known, roughly speaking, how much pressure increased. And depending on what system you were using, you could either use something like 1 atmosphere every 10 meters or 0.44 or 0.45 psi every foot, which obviously would then mean about 45 psi every 100 feet. And then for that, there would be 2 ways that you could fairly easily calculate crush depth. One would be the more sacrificial way, so you would perhaps have a scale model, or either a 1-to-1 scale model or perhaps a slightly small scale model, but 1-to-1 would be better. Not of an entire sub, but perhaps of a section of a sub, a section of the pressure hull, so the area where perhaps you had the largest surface area relative to distance between frames. And you could subject that to pressure in a tank and see when it failed. Now, of course, the slight problem with that is you're making a gigantic pressure bomb full of steel and water. So, yeah, maybe you might not want to do that. Another way of doing it would simply be to test the metal. So if, say, you were going to make a pressure hull with 1/2-inch thick steel, you could take a piece of that steel and you could subject it to the various stress tests that engineers do, work out things like its tensile strength and such like. And then you go, okay, well, we know that this plate of steel, perhaps you use a plate that is that you've suspended between 2 points to simulate a plate mounted on a pressure hull. We know if we put this much pressure from a big hydraulic press, this is when it will fail, or this is when it will rip out of its rivets if you're using a riveted pressure hull. And therefore, theoretically, that pressure should approximate to the crush depth, and then you would take back a small percentage, maybe 5-10% off of that for safety's sake, because obviously you're going to have build quality issues. The varying salinity and temperature of the water might also affect the exact depth in question. And you say, right, well, at this depth, this is when the thing should collapse. And then you take off a safety factor from that, and that would become your maximum operating depth. And then you take another safety factor off of that, depending on which navy you're in, which would be your test depth. So your test depth is how far down you're supposed to go in peacetime. Then your operating depth would be how far you're allowed to go down in wartime, perhaps if you're under attack. And then some distance below that would be the crush depth, where it's kind of like, yeah, you're not coming back from that point. But of course, all of this is based not obviously on full-scale 1-to-1 testing, and there are going to be variations in the quality of the sub based on, build quality, thickness of steel, the quality of the steel itself, etc. And this is why you have those safety factors, because if you've got perhaps a poor welding or poor riveting job, slightly substandard steel, etc., then you might rate your sub for, let's say, 700 feet, but in actuality, that particular sub might crush at 650 feet. But your operating depth, if you set that to 600 feet, it's not going to crush when it's down at that level. And then obviously your test depth would be even less than that. Conversely, however, if the steel that your sub is made of is of a higher quality than the type you tested, for whatever reason, either because you got a bit of a bad batch, the sub's built with a particularly good batch, or there's just been general improvements in steel quality since you did the tests, then you might end up with a sub that, again, let's say you've rated its crush depth at 700 feet, but thanks to good quality welds, good quality steel, and maybe the shipyards just factored a little bit more steel in. So you've said, well, okay, we're going to build a 1/2-inch thick pressure hull, but actually it's a 0.6 of an inch pressure hull, so a little bit more steel on there. Then its actual crush depth might be 1,000 feet. And so you do have incidences in the Second World War where submarines have gone 10, 15, 20, even 50 feet, or potentially occasionally more, past what is their notional crush depth. And while the sub hasn't been in the best of states when it's come back out again, it has come back up. Conversely, there were almost certainly instances where subs with slightly underperforming build quality went beyond their operating depth, hadn't quite reached their theoretical crush depth, but then imploded. But of course, we wouldn't know about that because they imploded and there wouldn't have been any survivors. And then, of course, you have to factor in things like damage as well, because a submarine that is perfectly fine, perhaps only at its normal peacetime test depth, but is then hit by a very close range depth charge shockwave, well, the localized pressure may well exceed its crush depth. That's what depth charge is designed to do, ultimately, obviously. But equally, because of the shock-absorbing capabilities of water, if you do go down to somewhere between your operating and crush depth and depth charge are exploding above you, you might actually be much, much safer because, yes, you're going to get a slight increase in pressure, but it's much less dangerous than being at a shallower depth, but with higher pressure from closer depth charges. Brian Stevens asks, I know about HMS Victory and USS Constitution as Age of Sail ships still under commission in their respective navies, but I'm not aware of any others. If there aren't any, does any navy keep perhaps more recent ships on the books for reasons of historical significance, or is this only a practice in the US Navy and the senior service? Well, there are obviously a few navies that have some very old ships like the Brazilian Navy Parnaíba and the Russian Kommuna, which are still in active service and still commissioned despite being, around a century or more old. However, in terms of recent ships, or more recent ships than the Constitution and Victory, kept commissioned for reasons of historical significance, as far as I can tell, the US and British navies seem to be the only ones that have done that on a consistent basis. The reason for the picture is, I think, although Chilean viewers may wish to correct me, but I think Huascar is actually technically still in commission. Although she was decommissioned at the end of the 19th century, she was then restored in the 1930s and apparently brought back into commission for that purpose. And I can't find any record of her being since decommissioned, so technically speaking, Huascar might actually be still in commission. She certainly seems, in recent photos as a museum ship, to still be flying the Chilean naval ensign. So that's potentially an exception to the rule. The other thing, which is the other ship, I would guess, which is close but not quite, would be the Bonaire, a gunboat of the Dutch Navy, which is in the process of becoming a museum ship, I think, at the moment, or has become a museum ship potentially. But she was in commission, technically speaking, until the mid-90s, but then decommissioned, so she doesn't count. So as far as I'm aware, the only navies that have a ship in commission mostly for historical purposes are the US Navy and the Royal Navy, with the possible also exception of the Chilean Navy. Gallias of Martinengo asks, does any data exist on the torpedo trials of the Nordenfelt submarines of the Greek and Ottoman navies? From what I've read, both countries were somewhat aware of those vessels having no real value beyond getting paraded in naval reviews. There is some data around. It's a little bit hard to get hold of, especially in English, but if you can go all the way back to the 1960s, there is, in an early issue of Warship International, a rather extensive article on the Nordenfelt submarines. And yeah, it doesn't really start out all that well. I mean, take this paragraph, for example. Sea trials for the Garrett Nordenfelt 1 were held at Landskrona, Sweden, that may, wherever that is, and attracted an assembly of naval experts from the major powers. The trials were a modest success in that the boat was not lost. The longest submergence lasted only 5 minutes, and on that occasion the boat struck bottom. The consensus of the experts was that the vessel had some possibilities as a semi-submarine, but that as a submarine she was no better off than most of her predecessors. It then goes on, the only successful test was a demonstration that the crew would remain in the sealed boat for 6 hours without asphyxiation, a standard bit of 19th century submarine showmanship that never failed to catch the public's fancy. A more severe drawback than the remote possibility of running out of oxygen in the course of the submarine's evanescent dunkings was the escape of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide from the furnace. Crew members were knocked out by these gases, and Garrett was once incapacitated for 3 weeks. Efforts to seal the leaks and repair other defects were made, and further trials were held in English waters. The two inventors were able to cure the boat's major defects to the extent that Greece was paid about $45,000 for her, or that Greece paid $45,000 for her in 1886. The Royal Hellenic Navy was not notably enthusiastic about submarines thereafter. However, the immediate upshot was to make the people in the Ottoman Navy skittish, especially since the intelligence from Russia revealed the existence of a fleet of 50 Zsky-designed submarines, useless toys in fact, but perhaps as worrisome as today's underseas menace from Russia to those who did not know their capabilities. Not surprisingly then, Turkey ordered 2 submarines from the Nordenfelt interests. It then goes on to describe some of the improvements that were attempted to be made to the Ottoman craft, and then goes on, far from improving the longitudinal stability, the fore and aft downhaul screws did nothing but exacerbate the most unwholesome teeter-totter of the boat. The submerged submarine refused to stay on an even keel for more than a few seconds at a time. The ballast tanks were designed for operation with free surfaces and were insufficiently subdivided. The water in these, together with that in the boiler and the hot water tanks, sloshed back and forth, exaggerating every deviation in fore and aft trim. The boat was so tender in pitch that if a greaser in the engine area moved a couple of feet forward, the boat would trim by the stem, sending water in the tanks surging forward, and unless checked in time, the submarine would end up in the mud or broach stern first. When the crew launched a torpedo, the boat almost stood on her stern and made a tail dive toward the bottom. Beside difficulties in submerged trim, the trial boat suffered from inadequate freeboard on the surface. She almost swamped once when the wash of a passing ship poured down her low open tower hatch. Despite obvious failings in the design, the Turks accepted the boats. Although just 6 men were required for one boat, the Ottoman Navy was unable to find engineers who would serve on a submarine, or a crew that would not desert. One of the boats was never even completely reassembled. Thus, the boats were never used, except perhaps as psychological deterrents, which implied that Turkey had an up-to-date navy with the latest weapons. During World War I, the remnants of these boats were found by the Germans in a shed in Constantinople. They tried to recondition them, but by then the vessels were beyond repair. There's also a Scientific American article about them dating back to 1901, but I don't have access to their archives. Admiral King's preferred shaving implement asks, on page 270 of Cunningham's autobiography, he states that the Malaya was untrustworthy on any operation because of her condenseritis. What is this condenseritis? Is it a technical term, or is it Cunningham having a bit of a cheeky dig? Now, this is actually a technical, or at least semi-technical term, in as much as it was officially used in navies. And it's an engineering problem. So Drach is a very happy Drach. So specifically, condenseritis was caused by what's known as an impingement attack on the tubes that bring seawater in to be desalinated and turned into fresh water for the ship's condensers. The main problem at this point, I just realised I should probably tell you what an impingement attack is, because there's probably a very minor part of the audience who actually understands. So an impingement attack, at least in terms of this context, we're talking about water and metal, is that when you have water flowing through a metal pipe, you obviously get an oxidation layer form on that metal pipe, and then it's stable. So, brass, copper, bronze, whatever, it'll go dull. So what you're looking at is if you take a fresh, really shiny copper pipe for your plumbing and in your bathroom or whatever, over time that'll go this dull brown on the exterior. That's the oxidation. Same thing happens inside. Now, because that is therefore stable, the water continues to flow. If you live in a hard water, you get calcium buildup, which, limestone calcium carbonate buildup is not good, but we're getting a bit off point. The point is that if you have a flow of water coming in at relatively high speed, in which are suspended some form of particulate, it could be particles, more commonly it's air bubbles, or it could be air bubbles and particulates, then a high velocity flow of water, particularly over an area where the pipe is perhaps bending, will cause an erosion of that oxide layer. Because, again, you take a copper pipe, if you give it a little bit of a scrape, you can polish it back up. Except now the water is doing this, effectively high-speed water with some kind of suspended particulate matter in it, or air, is sanding away the oxide. The underlying metal is a bit tougher, but of course it's in the presence of water, so it will oxidize again, which will then mean that the oxide will be worn away, so the metal is exposed, so oxides again, and so forth, and you can see pretty much what's going to happen very quickly. That water is going to essentially wear through the pipe, and you're going to get a failure of the pipe. And this problem first really crops up in a major way in the First World War, because obviously the rate at which this happens, or if it happens at all, depends quite a lot on how fast the water is flowing and over what time period. And in peacetime, when ships didn't really run at extremely high speeds for extended periods of time, it was still very slowly happening, but happening so gradually that other issues like, build-up of material and just general replacement and maintenance would occur long before the condenseritis did. And then in the First World War, everyone's running their machinery really hard. Problem shows up, everyone panics. How do you solve this? Okay, well, eventually, in the 1930s, they discovered that if you added a little bit of aluminium to your normal brass or copper tubing, then it made everything a little bit tougher, and the condenseritis problem was significantly reduced, if not eliminated. But that meant two things. Firstly, you had to replace all your condenser tubes, and secondly, it reduced the problem. It didn't eliminate it entirely. So fast forward to World War II, and Malaya hasn't really had a significant refit since the mid-30s when this solution has been invented. And so she doesn't really have the solution implemented in her condenser systems. And so what's happening is, well, her condenser tubes keep failing. And the only way to solve that is to replace the condenser tubes, but you can't really do that while you're at sea. The best thing you can do is pack the leaks. But of course, if you are suffering leaks from your saltwater intakes to your desalination plant, then you're not able to produce as much fresh water for your boilers, which means you have a bit of a catch-22 of either you reduce speed because you're not able to produce enough fresh water to keep up with the demands of your boilers at full power, which means you fall back, which means you're unreliable machinery-wise, which is what Admiral Cunningham indicated, or you use some salt water, in which case you are putting a very, very short lifespan on what's left of your boiler tubes, which perhaps might work in an emergency, but is not something that is a viable long-term solution, because the cost and time needed to repair and replace all your boiler tubes after you've packed them full of salt water steam is going to be a lot longer than it is going to be ripping out your condenser feed tubes and replacing them with presumably more intact and or better metallurgy tubes. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, what are the true dimensions of Rosyth's dry docks? I've read that they were 100 feet wide, 110 feet wide, or 125 feet wide prior to their widening in 2010. So what were their true dimensions during World War I and II? The answer is yes. All of those figures are in fact accurate, just at slightly different times. So what they're actually reflecting is gate widths, both in different places and at different points. You can see here, here's King George V in one of the Rosyth dry docks. Now, the 100-foot figure is what the dry dock gate width was when the complex was originally put together in the early part of the 20th century. The 110-foot figure is what the gate width is at the entrance to the docking pool immediately outside of the dry dock, but which in and of itself is also quite a useful dock and has a what you might call a throughput dry dock potential as well. Look at some aerial photos, you'll see what I mean. And then the 125-foot figure is what the gates were then upgraded to later on, when it was appreciated that actually this perhaps wasn't going to work in the long term. So initially, prior to the First World War, the plan is to have your 110-foot wide entrance into the basin and then your 100-foot wide entrance into the dry dock itself. But then almost immediately everyone's going, hang on a minute, we've got 90-foot plus Queen Elizabeth class under construction. If we stick anti-torpedo bulges on them, you're going to be talking about, barely a foot or two either side of them to get through even the 110-foot gate, and they physically won't get through the gate into the dry dock itself. So maybe we need to make these gates bigger. And so in the middle of the First World War, well, starting just before, but then going through the First World War, measures are taken which increase the gate widths up to 125 feet, which is why you're able to get the Queen Elizabeths with bulges, the King George V's, and later on the Audacious class, which are 112 feet wide, into Rosyth's dry dock. But when they come to building the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers, they're too wide even for that. Alred Wilmore asks, realistically, how did the Dutch imagine a successful defense against the Japanese Empire in an East Indies campaign going? Did they have war games and plans like the Americans and other great powers? The Dutch plan essentially looked at 3 potential scenarios, all of which involved obviously the Japanese trying to come and invade the Dutch East Indies. Scenario 1 was that the Japanese sent a large convoy with troop ships and so forth, but with minimal to no escort, so they didn't imagine that the Dutch would particularly resist. And when I say minimal escort, i.e. this was defined as an escort which the cruisers and destroyers of the Dutch fleet could successfully defeat or circumvent in a fleet battle. And so in that scenario, the plan would be to use the cruisers, like the De Ruyter here, and some of the destroyers to go out and hit the troop convoy well before it got anywhere near the Dutch East Indies, damaging it and destroying it potentially, or at least destroying some of the ships, making the invasion pretty much impossible. Option 2, and bear in mind option 1 might then lead to either option 2 or 3, option 2 was the invasion convoy is too heavily escorted to be directly confronted in the open sea, but is potentially still within the realm of the overall defensive capabilities of the Dutch to deal with. So in this scenario, you would have attacks on the convoy from Dutch submarines, the K-boats, not the British K-class, the colonial boats. They would attack the escorts and the convoy on its way across. As it got closer, you'd also have attacks from destroyers and from aircraft, and the destroyers and the cruisers would also be busy laying mines in various places to try and channel the invading forces both into areas where submarines, destroyers and aircraft could most easily attack, kind of preset killing grounds, but also to channel the invasion convoy towards shore batteries. And the idea being essentially to wear down particularly the escort at that point to the stage where a final attack using whatever submarines and destroyers had survived, plus coastal batteries, plus the cruisers, could finish off the convoy. Again, hopefully before it landed, or if some of it did land, finish the convoy off immediately thereafter, at which point the Japanese troops would have little in the way of supplies. So those were the 2 scenarios in which the Dutch might be able to actually defeat a Japanese invasion attempt. However, they did acknowledge that both of these were relatively unlikely because a force that would exceed the capabilities of the Dutch Navy and Air Force in the Dutch East Indies to attrition away, even with minefields and coastal batteries and submarine attacks, was not that difficult for the Japanese to put together. So in that scenario, so option 3, they essentially went, well, we have an awful lot of oil generating capacity. The British and the Americans are not going to want that to fall into the hands of the Japanese because 1, it'll rule out the availability of that oil to themselves, and 2, it'll give the Japanese a bunch of oil, and if the Japanese are on such an expansionist streak, well, you really don't want them to have that oil, i.e. the Americans and or British will come and defend the Dutch East Indies out of their own interests, just as long as you can hold out long enough. So in that scenario, again, you attack the incoming Japanese fleet with your submarines to try and slow them down, but instead of throwing your destroyers in as well, basically every surface ship, and potentially some of the subs as well, are wholly devoted to laying the world's most concentrated minefields off of all the potential easy landing spots, and even some of the less obvious ones, as well as defensive minefields around ports and so forth, with the express intention of either the Japanese go straight for the landing sites, hit the mines, blow up, fantastic, or the Japanese realise that there will be mines, or they hit the first few mines, whatever, and divert, at which point you have essentially a siege going on where the Japanese will try to bombard the ports and the coastal batteries while the submarines, the destroyers and the cruisers harry and look for gaps in the Japanese defences to try and take out transports, ideally, and if necessary, directly torpedo Japanese warships, and basically delay the inevitable landing of Japanese troops long enough for much stronger British and American forces to show up and finish off the Japanese. Nosdormu89 asks, in Master and Commander, when they head south, at one point Bondon says she's backing. What does he mean by that? So I went through the run to the south where they're chasing the Acheron towards the Horn, and I didn't find any instance of them saying that the ship is backing. I did find an instance of Bondon saying the ship is broaching, so I think that's what you mean. If not, please let me know either by message or something and let me know the timestamp you do mean. But if it's the bit that I think you're referring to, which is about 51 minutes in, then broaching is when a ship suddenly, violently and unexpectedly changes course. And at the time, the reason why it's so dangerous to the Surprise is because, well, they've just lost the top of one of their masts. The rigging is still holding the wreckage to them, and as they then go on to say, that wreckage is acting as a sea anchor. So essentially they've been heading in one direction in a storm, obviously trying to keep themselves as safe as they can. This wreckage has gone over, it's then yanked the ship, and then the ship's swerved, so it's now on a different course, which is causing it to roll and pitch far more heavily, take a lot more water over the deck, which is obviously threatening the safety of the ship, which then leads to the whole sequence where they have to choose to cut the wreckage loose, even though they have a man overboard. Library of Context asks, other than the Supermarine Spitfire and the theoretical German naval aircraft, have there ever been any other notable navalized land-based aircraft? And has the process ever worked the other way, i.e. a landized naval aircraft? In the time period the channel covers, it's far more common to see land-based aircraft in naval service than the other way around. So, for example, here you can see an Osprey, which is more commonly known as a Hawker Hart on land, but the Osprey was a naval development of it. Then, of course, you have the Sea Gladiator, which is a Gladiator put into Fleet Air Arm service. The Fairy 3F saw so many variations and developments, a number of which ended up in naval service as well. You have Sea Hurricane, Sea Vampire, Sea Mosquito, obviously all navalized versions of land-based aircraft, and that's just in the Royal Navy. Now, there were the occasional times that a naval aircraft would become quite well established on land, at least temporarily. For example, some examples of the Helldiver, the monoplane version from the US Navy in the Second World War, were briefly employed as dive bombers in the US Army, although it turned out that just as they entered service, the US Army had actually decided that fighters could do the job just as well. And the Sea Fury, although it didn't have a land-based service in the UK, it did end up having land-based service in a number of countries it was sold to, countries that never actually had aircraft carriers, just put it into general land service. But by and large, the period the channel covers is mostly looking at propeller-driven aircraft, and in that time period, the sacrifices you had to make to essentially ruggedize an aircraft to withstand the pressures of sea operations meant that if you tried to put it on land, yes, you'd get a fairly tough aircraft, but a land-based aircraft that didn't have quite the same level of ruggedness would obviously weigh less and therefore would have significantly better performance. And when it came to strike aircraft, well, on land-based airfields you could have 2, 3, 4 engine bombers, so a single-engine naval strike aircraft didn't have all that many places that it could fulfill in a land-based air force roster. The transition from naval aircraft to land-based aircraft was a lot more common in the Cold War, though. Now, obviously, that is well past the channel's time period, but, for example, the F-4 Phantom was originally a naval fighter, but very rapidly became also a US Air Force fighter. Hark asks, I really enjoyed the video about the reasons why French pre-dreadnoughts looked as they did, but I came away from it wondering about their funnels. Not the number, but the design. Some of the ships shown have funnels that come equipped with two-part lids or covers, and they also sometimes have a sort of collar. These two features seem independent of each other. Some have lids but no collar, some have collars but no lids, some have both, some have neither. I could see the lids being used to close the funnel when the furnaces connected to it are all turned off, which is necessary to prevent rain or snow from coming in, but why not use what is usually done to prevent that, covering it up with canvas, held on by a scaffold-like structure? Well, you're right about the lids. If you look through enough photos of French pre-dreadnoughts, you will generally catch them with one or both sets open or possibly one or both sets closed. I chose this particular picture because it actually shows the fore funnel with the lid shut and the aft funnel with the lid open, and it's fairly clear that this is what's happening. And yep, that's basically keeping the funnels nice and undercover when the ship's boilers aren't running, at least the ones supplying smoke, etc. to that funnel, and then that opens when they do. Now, as for the reason as to why you aren't using the canvas covers, well, bearing in mind that being a pre-dreadnought, there's going to be quite a lot of boilers, but you generally want to cycle through your boilers. And so having these lids in place, well, one, they're a little bit more secure. They're less likely to blow away than canvas. But it also means that at any given time, as you're cycling through your boilers, whether that be at sea or in harbour, you don't have to send a work party up there to dismantle and remove the canvas cover and potentially any scaffolding as well. You just pull a lever and you're ready to go. Now, as for the collars, yes, they're independent from the lids, and you can kind of see them actually just below the opened lids here on Charlemagne. But those, as far as I can tell, and I'm not 100% on this because I haven't been able to find all the documentation yet, but they appear, well, they definitely are marking the end of an outer casing to the funnel. So you can see the upper, in the black and white photo, black portion of the funnel. That is actually the width of the funnel all the way down to the boilers. The wider white part below the collar is an additional casing around the funnel, which has, where the collars are, openable windows or slats to allow air in and out. Now, the bit that I'm not 100% sure about is what exactly the purpose of these are. I mean, the logical thing, obviously, is to insulate the ship and everybody from touching potentially an extremely hot funnel side by just basically wrapping them up in an air gap. But the fact that they have these open and shuttable bits at the top, and according to the diagrams I can find, the casings also run down with the funnels all the way down to the engine rooms without the interference of decks, which you wouldn't need if it was just a insulative casing, seems to indicate there is an airflow function to them as well. Now, of course, the question is, are they functioning as a casing and then the hotter air that's being generated within that casing is venting out the top? And therefore you're just getting a graduation of heat from the funnel out to the rest of the ship. Or are they functioning as additional output? So if you get overpressure in the boiler room, are they venting that? Because they're not connected directly to the trunking and the funnels themselves. They just kind of end when you get into the engine room. Are they functioning as a form of air intake? So perhaps you get pre-warmed air being sucked down past the funnel into the boiler room, and then obviously warm air being injected into the boiler, which then comes out as heated air up the trunking and up the central part of the funnel. The fact they can open and close potentially indicates something, so maybe they're closed to allow the forced draft to take place. As I said, I haven't found a detailed examination of exactly what the function of these casings seem to be, but the purpose of the collars is to mark the termination of the casing, and where you have double collars to support the opening and closing of these vents. If anybody knows a bit more detail about those casings, I'd be really glad to hear about it. Vokir asks, how much of the Guppy and FRAM modifications done to late World War II ships could have been done during their original construction? And do you think any of these design decisions could have been especially useful during World War II? So, starting with the FRAMs, I don't think most of the changes that were made during the FRAM modifications could have been done because, well, most of the systems that they were in aid of didn't exist at the time. So, you got things like ASROC, more advanced sonar, homing lightweight anti-submarine torpedoes, etc. Well, they're all great, but none of those technologies existed in World War II, so modifying the ships to accommodate them, and the less said about the Dash helicopter drones, the better. It's a thoroughly pointless exercise to do in the early 1940s, because, if there's no weapon to install, why bother taking working weapons off and when you could put functional ones like 5-inch 38s on? About the only thing from the FRAM modifications that might have been somewhat useful, although perhaps less so on the gearings, more so on the Fletchers, was the installation of a Hedgehog launcher, with some ships sacrificing their super firing forward mount for it. Now, on the gearings, that means sacrificing 2 5-inch guns, and given that the US has plenty of destroyer escorts and the gearings do have depth charges, I'm not necessarily sure losing a third of your firepower is worth it, but for the Fletchers, losing 1/5 of your firepower in exchange for a Hedgehog launcher might be useful. It just depends on how badly you rate the Japanese submarine threat, because that's what the Fletcher's going to be contesting with for the most part. Now, as for the Guppy program, there are a few things that would be of benefit, but again, not the whole lot. So, one of the big advantages of the Guppy program was newer, more powerful batteries. Well, they, by dint of being newer post-war, didn't exist during the Second World War, so there's no point, again, in putting in batteries that don't exist. Perhaps a little bit more general battery capacity might have been useful, although maybe not as much as was in the actual Guppy program, because that did seem to compromise habitability, which was quite important on long patrols in the Pacific. Now, the thing in the Guppy program that I think probably would have made the most benefit is not, in fact, the snorkel, because the snorkel wasn't perfected in the States until well after the war. Even the Germans took a while to adapt it. So during the war, while they're being built, you don't want to stick a technology that you don't actually have properly working on just yet. But the reshaping of the bow and the streamlining of the superstructure, that could be very useful. Now, the reason I say it could be a bit controversial is because it does involve the removal of the deck gun, and as we know, towards the end of the war, the US submarines did make a fair bit of use of their deck guns. The flip side is that if you're talking about when they're actually building in the first place, back when the Japanese actually had a navy, as well as a reasonably extensive merchant marine, then the underwater benefits of all this reshaping with increased underwater speed and endurance and so forth would actually, I think, be quite good. You would, of course, compromise surface speed a little bit, which might come as a bit of anathema to World War II era submarine captains who are used to manoeuvring on the surface, getting in position, and then striking to a limited degree of using a limited degree of underwater travel. But I think if you offered them not quite type 18 or type 21 underwater speeds, but underwater speeds in the low to mid-teens of knots, that actually gives you quite a decisive advantage in being able to just bypass convoy escorts and so forth underwater, and of course escape convoy escorts much more better underwater. So I think on balance for the duration of the war, the streamlining might well have been a big advantage, and that could quite easily have been done in the early 40s. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I find the often repeated maxim that navies built too many fast battleships in light of the ascendancy of the carrier to be facile equally perplexing. Comparatively few historians posit a similar argument with respect to the last generation of pre-dreadnoughts. The Lord Nelsons were handsome ships, but it is curious that they and their contemporaries were not nixed. What do you think was more justified, the last generation of fast battleships or the last generation of pre-dreadnoughts? Personally, I think the general arguments against construction of fast battleships and the construction of last generation pre-dreadnoughts are, for the most part, very much rooted in hindsight. Because, well, let's start with the pre-dreadnoughts. The last generations of pre-dreadnoughts were generally either under construction or just about to be constructed when Dreadnought made herself known. So if you've got a ship under construction, it's probably going to net cost you a fair amount to cancel it. You know, cancellation fees to the dockyards, plus all the money you've invested already, in exchange for getting nothing, as opposed to spending the rest of the money and getting something. And on top of that, obviously, even when Dreadnought makes herself known, there's still only one of her. You know, the High Seas Fleet has pre-dreadnoughts on its roster until 1916. The Grand Fleet has pre-dreadnoughts on its roster until 1914. They still, up until World War I and mid-World War I in the case of the Germans, have a place in the battle line, at which point having a really powerful pre-dreadnought is better than not having one. And, of course, you've got distant stations and other uses, etc., etc. And even for the nations where you can perhaps hold a little bit of a light up to them and say, oi, okay, look, for those like the Lord Nelsons and the Connecticuts and so forth that were under construction, Deutschlands even, we can forgive those. But what about those who built pre-dreadnoughts, from keel up after the advent of Dreadnought? Well, even in those cases, there's a certain amount of justification because a lot of the nations that did that either couldn't afford dreadnoughts at the time or hadn't gotten around to being able to actually design them yet. So, again, better a really powerful semi-dreadnought, if you like, where at close range or in groups of 2 or 3 they might still counter a dreadnought than nothing, which is your other option. And the same thing with fast battleships. Basically, every fast battleship was laid down at a point where it is eminently possible to argue that carriers were in no way, shape or form as powerful as they would become during the Second World War. The doctrine, if you look even at 1940, the doctrine and the aircraft for aircraft carrier usage compared to what you'd see in the Pacific in the middle and latter stages of World War II is pretty abysmal. British carriers don't have that large an air group, and Japanese carriers, the Kido Butai doctrine that they would have, doesn't really exist in 1939 and early 1940. It's a very late development. The US Navy is still running around with its aircraft carriers in single ship detachments, one carrier plus escorts, and they're still wedded to the launch everything on your deck all up in one go, which, as you see at Coral Sea and Midway, takes forever and a day. And the quality, speed and durability of the dive bombers and torpedo bombers and even the fighters and scouts that are available to all 3 carrier navies in 1939 is a far, far cry from what would be available in 1941. And really, the only class of battleship that's started and actually sea ships enter service after 1939 is the Iowas, and one of the South Dakotas, I suppose, as well. But anything that postdates that doesn't get built, and even some things that predate that, like the Lion class, don't get built. And mysteriously, that's around about the time when aircraft carriers are beginning to show their rise towards dominance. And then during the Second World War itself, while, yes, you can argue the carrier is becoming dominant, it still isn't entirely dominant, and the battleship still has a very useful role to play in escorting carriers and protecting them in general, not just from surface ship attack forces, which gives you the courage to put your carriers forward because you know that they're protected, or you hope, but also even in the case of carrier versus carrier battles, because, you have the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, aka the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and that went really well for the US Navy, but while I'm not necessarily saying the US Navy would lose the battle, how much worse could it have been if you didn't have Admiral Lee's battleship line acting as both massive anti-aircraft farm and bait for the initial Japanese air attacks, because the vast majority of those early air attacks come swarming in on the far more durable and far more heavily armed battleships, which A, blow a lot of Japanese aircraft out of the sky, and B, every Japanese aircraft that attacks the American battle line is not an aircraft that's attacking the far more vulnerable carriers. If you didn't have that fast battleship line, then those Japanese aircraft from those initial attack waves would have pressed on and probably hit Mitch's carriers. Now, as I said, given the submarines taking out Shikaku and Taiho, the day was already won in terms of a net balance of losses. But if you didn't have the battleships there, it's entirely possible the Japanese pilots might have damaged or even destroyed some American carriers, which wouldn't have been a very good thing. And that's before you get into the things that capital ships can do, i.e. battleships and battlecruisers can do, that even in the mid to late part of World War II, either all carriers or at least most carriers can't do. Things like night actions and shore bombardments and so forth. So, yeah, I think there's a plenty of justification for both the last generation of pre-dreadnoughts and the last generations of fast battleships. You just have to look a little bit deeper than, dreadnought and or carrier über alles. Nick Brodar asks, I'm reading James Renfro's Home Squadron detailing the US Navy's North Atlantic Squadron transformation from a collection of single cruising ships to a proper battle fleet. Did any other navies make a similar reinvention during the late 1800s? Yes, and actually you could make the argument that the majority of fleets which would feature heavily in World War I and World War II are actually undergoing a massive reinvention from a handful of small ships into a proper battle fleet in the late 1800s. So, consider the big fleets that are involved across World War I and II. The traditional fleets, i.e. the ones if you travel back to 1800, 1850, etc., and say, okay, what are the big fleets in the world? The ones that people will answer you then are the Royal Navy, the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, and the Russian Imperial Navy. If you go back to the 1800s, you might get the Spanish Navy as well, but the Spanish Navy doesn't really feature in World War I or World War II. So 3 navies. And of those, let's face it, the Russian Navy, aside from annoying Goeben in the Black Sea, and occasional tussles with some of the High Seas Fleet in Operation Albion in the Baltic, doesn't really make much of a major play for itself in World War I, and the Soviet Navy, likewise, while it is fairly active, it's not really seen as one of the big navies of World War II. And for that matter, the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, although it is quite extensively involved in World War I, it's not facing off directly against the High Seas Fleet, and of course in World War II, it sits out most of the war, either in Vichy hands or later on scuttled, which basically means in terms of the traditional navies that have a very major part to play in World War I and II, it's basically the British. Because as you said, you've got the Americans who are in the process of reinventing their navy from, Congress's personal rowboat fleet into an actual battle fleet. You've got the Japanese who are reinventing their navy from literally less than half a dozen warships privately owned by various samurai clan heads to, the Imperial Japanese Navy, which would have a small but important part to play in the First World War and a very major part to play in the Second World War. The German and Italian navies, which would both, the Italian Navy would feature, again, kind of like the Marine Nationale actually, and the Japanese, a small but important part in the First World War and quite majorly in the Second, and the German Navy would feature quite a bit in both the First and Second World Wars, but Germany and Italy as countries flat out don't exist in the middle of the 19th century. The Italians, to be fair, get on the road to unification slightly ahead of the Germans, but you're still looking at, the 1860s, 1870s. This is when Italy and Germany are actually pulling themselves together and working out what it actually means to be a country. And the Italians are inheriting this weird mishmash of ships from various Italian city-state kingdoms and trying to forge that into the Regia Marina. And the Germans are basically going, well, we have the Prussian fleet and, 2 rowboats and a frigate from everybody else. Now how do we expand this into the high seas fleet, or the Kaiserliche Marine? So yeah, pretty much all of the powers that will feature very heavily in the First and Second World Wars from a maritime perspective are all building themselves up to be what they will eventually become from various handfuls of small ships in the late 1800s. Dangerous Lines asks, why do some British battleships from the same era, like the Nelsons, have no blast bags on their guns, while others, like Hood, do? Basically comes down to the design of the turret, because the purpose of a blast bag for the most part is to provide a watertight and to a certain degree pressure resistant seal to keep water and blast pressure out of the turret. Now, blast bags are a relatively easy way of doing this, but as far as I can tell from the design documents, one of the concerns when they were constructing the Nelsons was that previously gun elevations hadn't been that much, therefore the opening in the front face of the turret wasn't that great, therefore there wasn't much need to try and protect that opening, at which point a blast bag, which of course has basically zero shell resistance, was perfectly fine. However, the Nelson class were designed for much greater elevation. Bearing in mind that even the Queen Elizabeth's only had 20-degree elevation, Hood had 30-degree elevation but was still using a modified 15-inch 42 turret, a Mark II in her case, whereas the Nelsons were designed for 40-degree elevation, which, as you can see here, meant a much larger opening in the faceplate of the turret. And so they decided that rather than go with a blast bag, they were going to try and give it at least some modicum of resistance, because now there was actually a not unreasonable chance that a shell might end up, at least in part, trying to get through that gap. And so, as you can see here, this was one of the few photos where you can actually get a very clear view inside. They put a armoured mantlet inside the turret. So as the gun went up and down, hopefully most of the pressure and waterproofing would be provided by the mantlet seal, but also it would protect from shell blast, shell splinters, and fragments of shell. If a shell had ricocheted off a gun or ricocheted off the armour faceplate itself, and prevent that from getting in. It probably isn't going to stop an armour-piercing shell actually barreling straight down into that little tiny gap, but given that this is a picture taken when the guns are at 0 degrees elevation, if the guns are pointing in the direction of the enemy and maybe 15-20 degrees elevation, the chance of a direct down-the-throat shot and through the mantlet was pretty minimal. Pretty much down to the same level of risk as blast bags had been evaluated at lower degrees of elevation for risk acceptability. Scott Jennings asks, this question is for Mini Drach. In the time period the channel covers, which naval adventure that your daddy likes to talk about makes for the best bedtime story? Well, there you go. Couldn't have put it clearer myself. Mark Griffiths asks, I just came across an account of the collision between HMS Quilliam and Indomitable. I'm curious to know more, as it was only a brief account. Could you please provide some details on the cause and any repercussions? Well, here's Quilliam looking a little bit worse for wear. So this all happens in May 1945. So we're talking about the British Pacific Fleet at this point. So Quilliam is part of the overall destroyer screen, and she's stationed a mile behind the Indomitable. But fog descends very thick fog, so she can't see what's going on. Visibility is less actually than the hull length of the Indomitable. One of the men aboard the Quilliam actually recorded it this way. So he said, "It had been during a fleet operation off Japan very early in the morning when the ships which had been on the anti-submarine screen surrounding the aircraft carriers in a circle moved into the centre of the fleet close to the ship they were to guard during the day. We were detailed to guard the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable by steaming a couple of cables astern of her. This would allow us to target any kamikaze planes that would have to fly over us to get at Indomitable. But we got it wrong and hit her on a 90-degree track doing a fair speed, and as we dragged down Indomitable's side, still under power, the bow and forecastle were forced right around and were basically hanging off the front of the ship at right angles. I had fortunately by then just got to the top of the ladder and did not get in the wreckage of the bow, but the noise of shattering metal was devastating. I did not think we'd struck a mine or been hit by a torpedo. I just wondered, what's happened now? When I'd got through the wreckage, I had a little further shock. In the water was a mass of sailors' caps floating on the surface, and it was some little time before I could confirm there were no sailors under them. The caps had all come from the sailors' mess deck lockers, which had been destroyed. In the end, all the moving and being flung about had fortunately not resulted in any injuries, but the darkness and not knowing what was going on was particularly frightening. The collision was probably the result of very poor light and dense fog. There was no official inquiry. There was Arthur Power, then Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Fleet, was rumoured to have said, "I know what happened. Quilliam hit Indomitable. Quilliam was given a false bow and taken to Drydock in Sydney. We were transferred to another ship and also taken to Sydney." And this puts into a little bit more context, because you might think, well, hang on, the ship should have radar, shouldn't it have seen this coming? But not only was Quilliam supposed to guard Indomitable, according to the account, she was closing in to do a very close guard. So 2 cables, one cable is 600 feet. So 2 cables, she's supposed to stay just 1,200 feet away from Indomitable's stern. And a Q-class destroyer, just in case you're wondering, is already itself almost 360 foot long. So you're talking about less than 4 ship lengths. And assuming that she was doing, let's say, 25 knots, that's a distance that she could cover in less than 30 seconds. And yes, radar existed, and yes, Quilliam did have radar, but radar wasn't accurate enough at that point, certainly at least the navigation radar at that kind of range, to give you a foot-by-foot distance measurement. So if you are coming up on what you think is your target, the Indomitable, you're thinking, okay, great, fantastic. We're coming into about 4 cables lengths. Well, you now have 30 seconds between actually being within 2 cable lengths and hitting the ship. And at what point along there do you figure you are perhaps getting a bit too close? And then what do? Do you try and break off? Do you try and slow down? Well, honestly, if you're in a several thousand-ton ship travelling at pace, you effectively don't have much of a chance to do anything, and any measure you did take wouldn't really do you much good, especially because, again, using the survivor's account, you're coming in pretty much, straight onto the broadside of the Indomitable, not the stern. So, yeah, if you'd realised at the very, very first instant that something had gone wrong and you were coming up on Indomitable's stern, if you put the rudder right over, you might just about get away with dodging past it. But if you're essentially T-boning the carrier, yeah, there's basically nothing you can do at that point to recognise what's gone wrong and correct it in time. Captain Oblivious asks, I watched a video on HMS Eurydice in 1843, a 26-gun 6th-rate corvette that sank in a storm. The video mentioned that Eurydice was the first of 6 experimental ships, Eurydice in particular having a narrow hull and shallow draft. But the video made no mention of the other 5 experimental ships, nor if they were actually ever built. Do you know what the other experiments were or were planned to be? Well, interestingly, as a 26-gunner, it might interest you to know that she was actually launched originally as a frigate, which, over 20 guns, 3 masts, that's perfectly logical. By the time she was lost, in the latter part of the 19th century, she had been re-rated as a corvette, but that was a post-facto rationalisation, as obviously frigates and so forth had gotten considerably larger during her service career. Now, as for the experimental side of things, Eurydice herself definitely was an experimental ship. She was designed to operate in shallow waters, so she had a very, very shallow draft, among other things. However, she didn't have any successors, particularly. Around the time she was built, there were other experimental ships being built, but they weren't directly connected to her. I think, without seeing the video for myself, but I think what's being referenced is more the fact that at the time that she's being built in the early to mid-1840s, there's a whole series of experimental squadrons being formed on a year-by-year basis to test out various elements of ship design, armament, and all other sorts of things. And some of the ships in those squadrons are indeed experimental in design themselves, but others are regular ships serving as a benchmark against which the experimental ships can be tested, and sometimes the experimental squadrons have no experimental ships in them in and of themselves, but the ships are there, as I said, to carry out tests of new propulsion systems or new guns or other things which are the actual experimental units. So I think that's probably what's being referred to. Although, interestingly enough, Eurydice herself was never actually in one of those experimental squadrons, at least as far as I can see. John McDonough asks, English is absolutely peppered with nautical terms and references that have entered common speech and are used commonly by people who've never seen the ocean or possibly a ship of any kind. Is this true of other languages? Are French, Spanish, Japanese, etc. full of nautical phrases that have become metaphors, or is English unique in this? Unfortunately, I don't know enough about foreign language slang and common phraseology to be able to tell you whether there's an extensive litany of nautical metaphors in those languages. However, I do know that we do have French and Spanish and Japanese viewers, so for those of you who do speak those languages as a mother tongue, are there nautical terms and references that are commonplace sayings in your languages? And if so, please let us know below what they are and what they translate into or mean. Lord Druken asks, you've mentioned in previous videos the British Navy held off on making breech-loading guns the standard armament on their warships until said guns got too big for muzzle loading to be practical. Did any other navy adapt breech-loading weapons as their standard armament prior to the British doing so, or did everyone just follow the British example? Well, in actual fact, Britain was quite behind everybody else in this regard, and that was largely down to this thing. This is an Armstrong 110-pound breech loader, as in this particular model's case, found on the stern of HMS Warrior. And I've gone into some detail at length at various Drydock episodes about why this thing was so terrible, but yeah, basically it was an early breech-loading cannon, and its breech was horribly inefficient. At best, it spewed hot exhaust gases back in your face, and at worst, the breech block jumped out and either smacked into the ceiling of the compartment you were in or hit you, depending on what direction it went in and how unlucky you were. This, and a handful of other failures with breech-loading weapons, rather put the Royal Navy off the whole idea. They thought it was stupid. You can kind of understand why. And they went back to muzzle loaders. That was forgivable in the early 1860s, but then as the 1860s progressed into the mid and late 1860s, then into the early 1870s, the Royal Navy was still just sitting there going, no, we don't like breech loaders, they don't work, we're quite happy to stick with our gargantuan muzzle loaders, thank you very much. In some ways, they were a little bit of a victim of their own success. They were initially a very early adopter of breech loaders, or should I say the recurrence of breech loaders, because there were also breech loaders in the Tudor period. But one of the risks of being an early adopter is that perhaps the technology isn't fully matured and worked out yet. And with the Armstrong guns, it really, really wasn't. That put the British off. However, other nations that were very hot on their heels, like the French, went in, they got breech loaders, and they didn't have a L'Armstrong manufacturer, so their breech loaders actually worked. They didn't have quite as disastrous a time, and so their French Navy did adopt breech loaders pretty quickly. So by the mid to late 1860s, there were quite a number of breech loading guns in Marine Nationale service. And similarly across various other nations, it just depended on who you bought them from. And to be honest, by the late 1860s and early 1870s, even British gun companies were manufacturing working breech loaders. They were just selling them to foreign customers because the Royal Navy wanted nothing to do with them. It was only when you had a series of circumstances, partly, as you mentioned, muzzle loaders, were getting incredibly impractical to reload, and then you had the explosion aboard HMS Thunderer, where it was accidentally double loaded, which is an accident that's pretty much impossible to occur with a breech loader. So they went, okay, maybe these muzzle loaders are getting a bit long in the tooth. Are there working breech loaders out there? And everyone turned around and went, yeah, welcome to 10 years ago. At which point the Royal Navy just kind of went, okay, I guess we have breech loaders now. Lofferton Henderson asks, Dr. Clark mentioned at one point that his ideal Royal Navy Treaty-era cruiser on a budget was more or less an Arethusa with 2 6.6-inch in A and Y positions, with 4 twin 4-inch in super-firing positions above the triples and 1 twin mount either side of midships, so every direction is in theory covered by 75% of your 4-inch mounts. On a hull somewhere between an Arethusa and a La Argentina, what is your ideal version of a cruiser with 2 6.6-inch and 4 twin 4-inch? With a 32 knot top speed, Arethusa or better range, Argentina or better armour, 2 triple torpedo tubes, and a reasonable light and medium anti-aircraft and anti-submarine capability. Given the Navy's penchant for aggression, would an all-forward main armament be preferable, leaving the whole rest of the ship for secondaries, anti-aircraft guns, anti-submarine weapons, and float planes? So, if I've understood you correctly, Dr. Clark's ideal ship would look something like this, and it's going to have a maximum full load displacement of around 7,000 tons. Now, yep, I can see that theoretically being a workable design. My only concern really would be where the aircraft handling facilities are going to be on a ship this size. In theory, yeah, I suppose you could move the torpedo launchers and the amidships guns a little bit aft, maybe move the funnel that I've positioned there a little bit aft and have Belfast-style aircraft handling facilities right behind the bridge and the superstructure. But my preferred option would be slightly different. Behold. And yes, it is an all-forward design, because as you know, I love my all-forward designs. Now, the reason I've gone for this all-forward design is admittedly contrary to what I've said about most cruisers, i.e. basically the smaller a cruiser gets, the more useful having all-round firepower is. And this is a small ship, so therefore it is liable potentially to be running away from some larger cruisers. So you might think, well, you need aft firepower. Well, you see, I've got you covered there. So yeah, I've got my 2 6.6 right up front. And then because I've been able to essentially deal with the entirety of the main armament and the superstructure early on, I've then got a nice compact, slightly spaced funnel trunk machinery in the middle. And as you can see, I've fitted a pair of twin 4-inch either side there. And then heading aft, now, because you can't stick aircraft launch facilities on ships in Ultimate Admiral dreadnoughts, what I've done is I've used a tiny little single 2-inch on top there. So you can see I've got a series of stepped positions on the aft superstructure. So where that little single gun is up top, that's where I would put the launch platform. And you can see there with the main mast, I'd also have the net hatch crane there. That would be my launch platform for a scout aircraft. And then you can see in both X and Y positions, I've got 2 further twin 4-inch. And then very Deutschland style, I've loaded my 2 triple torpedo launchers, or at that point you could even make them quads, right aft. And this is my solution to the lack of aft firepower if I have to go running away. Because, at most aft bearings, I'll still be able to shoot over the shoulder with my 6.6s. However, if I do get into a circumstance where I'm running away from something much bigger and nastier than me, I have these 2 triple torpedo launchers right aft. I can just send torpedoes their way, which is definitely going to make them break off. And by compacting up everything else, I now have 6 twin 4-inch aboard, but now while I can't bring 6 guns to bear forward, as Dr. Clark's design can. I can only bring 4 from the forwardmost wing mounts. I can, however, bring 4 sets of guns, so 8 guns total, all to bear on the broadside, and on quite a good set of arcs fore and aft. So I have a really, really nice anti-aircraft battery. In fact, I have twice the anti-aircraft battery of a town class, and a third again as much an anti-aircraft battery even as Belfast or Edinburgh. And if I'm going up against destroyers, this might actually be potentially even more useful than my 6-inch gun battery, because I actually have 2 more guns to bear on the broadside. Send Penguins asks, regarding the First Battle of Savo Island, the actions of Captain Bode of the USS Chicago come under a great deal of criticism for both his actions and inaction. I remember he was to be court-martialed, but he committed suicide before it came to that. I can't help but think of the trial against Captain McVeigh of the Indianapolis, and what a travesty that turned into. While I have zero question about the merit of calling for a court-martial, I can also understand that Captain Bode might have reason to believe he wouldn't have gotten a fair court, since after the savage beating the Navy took, a scapegoat would be wanted. Do you have an opinion about his actions that you're willing to share? I'm of the camp that's very critical of Bode, and in a lot of ways my reasoning is similar in principle to why I'm not particularly well disposed toward Admiral Jean Soule when it comes to Mers el Kabir. Essentially, obviously the circumstances are very, very different in their details, but essentially in both cases you have an officer who can act in one way or another, and if you act one way, then your actions logically follow in a certain way, and if you decide to act in the other way, your actions should logically follow in the other way. But in both cases, the officers in question failed to do either, and so ended up with the least possible optimal outcome. So when it comes to the First Battle of Savo Island, when the Japanese are sighted, largely helpfully when they essentially are opening fire, or in Canberra's case they actually spot them just a fraction before, mostly thanks to the float planes dropping flares, Canberra does what a captain of action does when confronted with an unknown situation. What is his mission? His mission is to protect the transports. What's going on? An unknown force of unknown strength is approaching from the north, roughly speaking. So what does he do? He swings his ship around and he places it between the presumed enemy and their presumed objective. Now, yes, it gets Canberra an absolute pasting, but that's Canberra's job. Its job is to guard the transports, and it's done that, even if it's only done that by absorbing Japanese and, most likely, and thanks to a case of friendly fire, an American torpedo from the other side. So, that's one way of doing things. Bode, however, decides that, well, okay, Chicago has been damaged by a torpedo and 1 or 2 shells, but Chicago just continues off steaming into the night and essentially disengages. Now, from a first line perspective, this is not a good thing, because what is Chicago's objective? Well, it's the same objective that Canberra had, to protect the transports. Well, what's he done? He sailed off into the night. If Makawa had decided to continue his advance, then, well, there'd be a crippled Canberra in the way. She's done her best to stop them and failed. But where's Chicago? She is supposed to be in the way, but she's not. So Makawa would have had essentially a free run, near as much as makes no difference, straight at the transports. Everybody is very lucky that Makawa doesn't do this and heads north. So Bode has already failed his primary mission. And yes, he's damaged, but, well, someone who speeds off into the darkness clearly isn't too worried about a massive great hole in their bow, even though he has one. Seems more interested in getting away from things. Okay, so not necessarily a man of decisive action, our Captain Bode, but there is still a potential explanation at this stage, which is, okay, he knows the Australia isn't there, so it's just him and Canberra as far as large ships are concerned. And perhaps Bode is thinking, well, if Canberra's just been so easily knocked out. If I go down as well just as quickly in terms of being knocked out of action, then nobody's going to know what's happening, which means the transports won't get any warning, and it also means that the rest of our forces won't know what's going on. So if Makawa does then choose to go past a crippled Canberra and a crippled Chicago, we lose the transports. And if Makawa decides to go after our other ships, they have no warning. So perhaps there is a certain logic to his action. If I sail off into the darkness and don't get engaged, then I can, depending on what Makawa then does, either warn the transports, hey, there's a bunch of Japanese ships coming, and then once you've got confirmation that the transports know and are evading, then you get in contact with the northern group and say, hey, look, guys, there's a bunch of Japanese cruisers. If you come to my position, we can cut them off. That's a valid tactic. Or, if he sees Makawa's cruisers doing what they actually do, which is head off after the northern force, he can radio ahead and go, hey guys, we just lost Canberra, I barely escaped with my life, there's a bunch of Japanese ships out here ambushing everybody, you need to get to battle stations and tell it, and, prepare to return fire. Also an acceptable way of doing things. But he doesn't do that either. He just takes Chicago off into the darkness and doesn't warn anyone. And I think that is why I come down to saying, well, Captain Bode really dropped the ball on this, because, essentially he has two courses of action. He can stand and fight and die like Canberra, or he can choose not to take that action, but choose to warn everybody else of what's going on, which potentially would actually save more lives. I mean, he doesn't necessarily know that leaving the route open to the transports isn't going to kill the transports, but applying a little bit of hindsight with the way things had played out, if Bode had sailed off and then said to the northern group, hey, prepare yourselves, it may or may not have saved the northern group entirely, but it certainly would have made Makawa's forces pay a lot more than they did. But having taken a route that opened that option up, he then didn't take up that option. And I think that would be the duty of a captain if he's not prepared to stand and fight like Canberra did. So he failed both potential elements of his duty, and thus he thoroughly deserved a court-martial. Physical Removal Enthusiast asks, in Das Boot, the crew members shout, Warschau, before climbing through each section of the U-boat. I presume this is meant to warn people that someone is coming through the doors. But why do they use Warschau as a warning, and was this actually the word used in this manner? Well, it is actually accurate, because Warschau, despite sounding a lot like either screw or Warsaw, as in the capital Poland, in German, is actually a German specifically nautical warning shout. It means warning or caution. As for exactly why this term exists in German, no one's entirely sure, but some German language dictionaries think that it's actually a corruption of English, i.e. English sailors yelling, watch out, as they go through, and German sailors just adopting that and slightly Germanizing it to Warschau, and thus you get this kind of naval slang where everyone understands what the meaning is, but it has no direct meaning, if you like. Ben asks, after the failed attempts by the Allies to reach Constantinople through the Straits of the Dardanelles in March of 1915, if they had redoubled the naval attempts rather than landing troops for a doomed campaign, could they have been successful? It seems that there were many pre-dreadnought battleships that were considered obsolete even at the time that could have been acceptable to risk. Would the biggest threat have been shore-based guns or mines? Mines certainly were the larger threat, because a single mine, as it turned out, could put down an entire pre-dreadnought battleship. The Ottoman shore batteries, while they could damage pre-dreadnoughts, really didn't actually have the firepower to stop any of them. And it would, even if they wanted to damage one, it would take multiple hits. And of course, the pre-dreadnoughts can fire back against them. They can't fire back against mines. So yes, in theory, it could have worked. I mean, historically, we know that actually they were very, very close to breaking through the Ottoman minefields, although theoretically the Ottomans could have laid more. But if you want to sort of do a little bit of an alt history to get the Allies to succeed at least in clearing the Dardanelles, there's one very, very easy way they could have done it immediately without really changing anything further back, and that's simply because, the man who would eventually become Admiral Cunningham, who at that point was a junior officer, Andrew Cunningham, he was sitting a little bit away from the Dardanelles as part of a destroyer flotilla that had been fitted out with minesweeping equipment. The trawlers that they were using for minesweeping not only had mostly civilian crews who didn't take very well to being under fire, but also obviously lacked really much of any ability to shoot back. And it turned out that the trawlers were so slow that even at maximum speed, when the Dardanelles currents were coming against them, they could barely make any headway, which explains why they were sitting ducks and so easy to hit. Whereas if they just summoned the minesweeping fitted destroyers, they could have easily run against the current. They would have been able to shoot back against the Ottoman guns that were shooting at them. They had full naval crews, so would have been much more disciplined under fire. And they could have just done a quick set of minesweeps and let the battleships through, most likely without hitting any mines. So, yeah, you could have forced the Dardanelles that way. If you wanted to dial things back even further to when they're preparing for the Dardanelles operation, you could potentially also do a really cheap and cheerful fitting of really crude, big, almost monitor-style bulges to some of the pre-dreadnoughts. Now, granted, not necessarily all of them, because one or two, like the Lord Nelson and so forth, the Allies might have wanted to keep around for other operations, but certainly old stuff like Bouvet and Ocean and Irresistible, all of which hit mines, those could very easily have had some cheap and cheerful big bulges slapped onto them, which would have slightly lessened their draft and would have put them in a lot better position to resist hitting mines. And combine that with the destroyers going in and doing the minesweeping instead, the Dardanelles could have quite easily, I wouldn't necessarily say forced all the way, but certainly the bit where the Allies got stuck could easily have been forced and, probably then carried all the way through into the Black Sea. You'd still have Goeben potentially waiting on the other side, but in theory you'd have at least Queen Elizabeth on the British side waiting to engage it. Matt Blom asks, I recently heard of an event at the beginning of World War II where a U-boat sunk the liner Athenia despite it carrying over 100 Americans. At the beginning of the war, and with Germany ostensibly trying not to draw the USA into a wider conflict, what context was there to this attack? Was the Athenia believed to be carrying some sort of critical military cargo, or why else was it attacked? Well, it's difficult to determine because the captain of the U-boat that sank the Athenia would himself be killed a couple of years later when his U-boat was sunk. However, at the time, he gave the excuse that he thought it was a troop transport or armed merchant cruiser. The problem is that he gave that excuse along with claiming that the ship had been darkened off normal shipping routes and zigzagging, and the whole thing was covered up and the U-boat's log was falsified. Now, in theory, you might think that sounds plausible. Perhaps you wouldn't see the guns of an armed merchant cruiser at a distance, or, a troop ship might look like any other ship, especially that early in the war. The problem is that everything that is verifiable about those claims is a complete pack of lies. The Athenia wasn't off of normal shipping routes, it wasn't darkened, and it wasn't zigzagging, as both the surviving crew of the U-30 and the passengers aboard would all later testify. At which point, whether or not the commander of U-30 believed it to be a troop ship or a armed merchant cruiser, or it becomes less and less plausible, especially since, as he actually did admit that he tracked it for multiple hours, things don't begin to add up. So, to me, it seems either the guy had the worst case of tunnel vision, perhaps he saw it, had a slight suspicion it was a troop ship, and then spent hours and hours and hours trying to find some way to justify firing a torpedo, and eventually was just like, stuff it, we're firing the torpedo anyway. Or he was just trying to catch up and get in a good firing position from the outset and didn't really care what he hit, and only really backtracked on it all once it became very clear that nobody, including the Kriegsmarine, was very happy with him. And finally, for this half of the Patreon Drydock, Classe Cornate asks, assuming the Washington Naval Treaty also puts a building moratorium on cruisers, something that's reinforced by First London, the British get their 3 Hawkins, the Japanese get the Furutakas, and the US get 3 of what will become the Pensacola's, similar to the British arguing for the Nelsons. Armoured cruisers larger than 10,000 tons must be scrapped, but anything below that can be kept with no upper limit. As this essentially eradicates cruiser construction until the treaties collapse, how does World War II now look, especially in Iron Bottom Sound and the Mediterranean? Well, I think there's probably going to be 2 rather interesting implications of this. Firstly, there's going to be a crash cruiser building program in the mid-30s, but also it might actually have an even worse effect on national infrastructure, because now you're talking about not just the big battleship gun foundries, but even gun foundries that are making 8-inch or 6-inch guns potentially going without an awful lot of work, and dockyards that were kept afloat by that work, or building cruisers, no pun intended, that those might also go under. So there might actually be significantly less naval infrastructure available for the rearmament process. And when they do start building cruisers, obviously they don't have the design iterations that you have in real life, but perhaps you will have a constantly evolving series of designs going on during the period like you have with battleships until the battleship building holiday expires. So the kinds of ships that are going to be built in the mid-30s, I think, would be probably reminiscent of the late 20s and early 30s ships. They wouldn't be frozen in time back with single gun turrets and wing-mounted guns like with the Hawkins class, but they wouldn't be quite as advanced design-wise, I think, as they would be historically by that point. But the other interesting thing that I think you would see is the growth of the super destroyer much, much sooner. So you have things that, like the Royal Navy draws up in the 30s, designed V, which is essentially a halfway house between a Dido and a Tribal. I think you would start to see not just regular fleet destroyers, but I think you'd see people going, okay, we're going to build regular fleet destroyers, but we're also going to build these really, really large destroyers that are absolutely pushing the limit of what could be defined as a destroyer. Now, of course, the big wrinkle in all of this is that the Washington Naval Treaty doesn't actually define what a destroyer is, because it's interested on limiting the construction of capital ships. So it tells you what is and isn't a capital ship, but it doesn't tell you what is a cruiser and what isn't a destroyer. So I think you'll see a lot of super destroyers, because they will have to define what a cruiser is. But then these super destroyers, probably 3,000 ton, maybe 10 gun ships, will probably be built. And the Royal Navy will probably look at them and go, I'm sure we could get a partially decent trade protection ship out of that, or slightly larger. Now, of course, the London Naval Treaty does specify what a destroyer is. It says it's not above 1,850 tons and not above 5.1-inch gun armament. But what would be the definition of destroyer and what would be the lower bond of cruiser that would be put into the Washington Treaty? You'd have to establish that to work out just how much the various powers would push their quote-unquote large destroyer, honestly not small cruiser gov program. And that's it for the first half of the Patreon Drydock. Thank you for listening so far. See you on the other side for part 2.